Welcome to MikeDrop, the podcast where relevancy is irrelevant and we don't give a shit about your feelings.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome my next guest to the podcast. She is a wife and a mother, an Emmy award-winning journalist, to include the DuPont Award for her work in Afghanistan. She's most famous for the many years she has spent at 60 Minutes, including interviewing me for the special. She can drink me under the table and swears enough to make my former teammates blush, and Barbara Walters dresses up for her for fucking Halloween. Welcome to the stage, ladies and gentlemen, Lara Logan.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me into your home. It's an amazing place to be, and we were just talking before we got started. To me, the irony and just the duality or the weird factor, I guess, of 6 years ago, almost to the day, actually. I mean, because It was about this time 6 years ago for the 60 Minutes piece where you were in my house interviewing me, and so to be able to do that is beyond an honor, frankly. So I really can't thank you enough for having us down here and being able to do this with you.
And just before I did this, did an event, and one of the guys who came up to me afterwards at the event said, guess what his favorite story of all time was of mine on 60 Minutes?
It couldn't have been mine.
It was.
No shit.
Seriously.
Really?
Which really made me laugh because I knew I was about to see you.
That's crazy.
I know.
That was the event you just did.
Yeah.
Oh shit, that's awesome. I mean, it's a crazy turn of events, and again, it's just it's pretty surreal to be interviewing you. So I appreciate you letting us come do it.
Thanks.
I like to throw out a couple of just kind of stupid questions to get the ball rolling. Not that you need to be broken in or anything like that, but I like to provide a little bit of backstory for the listener because we do have kind of a wide swath, whether it's a
for all the people who have absolutely no idea who I am.
I think most people do, but there's, whether it's a beta male or a Mormon grandmother listening, people like to hear weird shit. So, what is your favorite breakfast dish?
Bacon.
Bacon by itself.
I had to have a pound of bacon every day.
Oh shit.
Yeah, and I start my morning with a Bailey's coffee.
Really?
My family think I have a problem, but that's my husband makes that for me every morning.
Yeah. Joe, we're going to need maybe a round of those to get started. Worst hangover you've ever had?
Oh, oof. Wow. So I'm an enthusiastic drinker and not a very talented one. So it doesn't take much to put me in the ICU.
Do that a lot of them?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I didn't actually start drinking till I was like 37. I mean, I had a couple of, crazy nights, but I wasn't much of a drinker at all because I was always that girl that everyone thought was drunk when we were, I don't know, flashing our boobs out the car window or taking our clothes off and skinny dipping. But I did all of that sober growing up. I never needed to be drunk to go nuts. It was always like an easy decision for me, and I wasn't self-conscious, So I just didn't give a shit, basically, and also I hated being hungover because I was always a person who wanted to tear the day to pieces, and the thought of staggering around, with a headache was seemed just so pointless to me. Yeah. So I really, my worst hangover, Mike, there's been a couple times that I would rather not remember.
Don't you want to talk about?
Yeah. No, it's a blur.
I'm right there with you. And that's just this week, for Christ's sake. What's the most embarrassing thing that one of your children has ever done while you're there?
One of the most embarrassing thing my children, not to me though, just embarrassing.
Yeah, it could be anywhere. You're somewhere with your kids or whatever, and they embarrass the shit out of you. Because I've got about 1 million stories with mine, but
it takes a lot to embarrass me, I got to say. And I also usually don't care a lot what other people think. Yeah. So the one thing that my daughter did to my husband once, when I was in hospital in the years after Egypt, when I had a number of health issues after being attacked there. And Joe brought the kids to come and see me in hospital. And when they got in the elevator, as they were leaving, this very large individual got into the elevator. And so my daughter, in her loudest whisper, said to her brother, Joe. What did she say, Joe? her butt is huge.
And then, of course,
Which
everybody can hear it.
really is nowhere to go from that. You couldn't cover that. So I think I remember him saying, Lola, and she said, what? It is. Yeah. So we had a long conversation after that particular event. He phoned me by the time the elevator had hit the ground floor and the woman was out of earshot. He was like, you will not believe what Lola just did to me.
Yeah. How old was she at that time?
4 or 5?
Yeah.
4. She was 4.
Yeah. No, I mean, mine have cussed as bad as I have in front of strangers. I mean,
that doesn't embarrass me. Mine do that.
Yeah.
You said embarrassing story, Mike.
To me, as a dad, and especially as a former SEAL, people are looking at me like, that's fucking great. Like, you got a daughter that's swearing.
I would just not be surprised that your daughter swears.
No, she.
And people would be shocked if mine didn't.
So, not being from this country, what are 3 things that you love about the U.S.?
Well, I really love the U.S. because otherwise, I wouldn't. I gave up a lot not to be in South Africa because it's a big thing to me. I really love South Africa, and I'm very much still an African at heart. But I'm also, I think, just instinctively American at heart too, because the thing that is most important to me about this place and about life is freedom.
Yeah.
That's everything. And when I was growing up in South Africa, to watch and listen to people like Nelson Mandela, and to be in a rally with 50, 60, 80, 100,000 people, and feel the ground move, when they toy, which is an African dance for freedom, like that's the thing that is just most synonymous with America for me. And my friend Jewel, the singer, who some of you listening to this may know, who's just one of the most spectacular women I've ever met in my life. Jewel said to me on the phone the other day, freedom is in you. Nobody can take it from you or give it to you. And I thought about how true that is. So this, America for me, is the place that flies the flag for freedom. There's lots of, freedom can be found anywhere. But what's so important about this place and this country is that it's a defining thing,
Yeah.
And so above all, freedom. I have always been free. Nobody owns me, right? Nobody's ever going to own me, for better or worse. The greatest thing in my life to work for 60 minutes professionally, but I don't really work for 60 minutes, right? I work for something independent of all of that. I work for the truth. Like, that's what I'm always trying to find. It doesn't matter who I work for. So freedom is just such a fundamental thing for me. It's so important. And, that's how a man like Nelson Mandela can, at his trial for treason, can say, convict me innocent or, guilty, whatever you find me. Like, this is what I represent. If he said that freedom in the courtroom at the Rivonia terrorism trial, where the South African government really wanted to sentence Mandela to death, he stood there and said that he was fighting for freedom. And he said, it's an ideal I want to live for, but it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. Well, there's nothing more free than a man with no control over the decision that's about to be made over his life, to have the freedom to say that and mean it, right?
Absolutely.
So it's such a big thing for me. It guides me. It's inspired me. It's in every fiber of my being. And there is no country on earth that is more symbolic of that ideal, and whose example has been a light for so many. So there's, I know there's lots of criticism, and much of it valid and some of it not, that you can point towards the U.S. But that thing and what the U.S. has done to inspire and sometimes lead, not always, for that's what I love about America. Then what else do I love? Well, my children are born here. Yeah. So this place for me gave me, my children, and were the most important thing in my life, and my husband and my family, and it's my home. So I love that. But I think, if you want a list of things I love that are truly American, I love I love tacos. I love tacos. I love blue jeans.
Yeah.
I love Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
I love Lukenbach, Texas.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I could give you 20 more things. I know I've already answered the question, and I probably took too long.
No.
But and what I love too about the U.S., I love that the U.S. is almost like a different country everywhere you go.
Yeah.
And I love that people think they got everything figured out. And, you know, every time I sit down with someone else, whether it's in Northern California or, you know, bumfuck country town somewhere. Oh, wait, like this one.
Yeah.
I love that this place constantly surprises me, and I'm always discovering something else. That's a great thing to me.
I mean, to me, to hear that answer is for me amazing, because I think, especially having been all over the world and interacted with a lot of people who aren't from here or have never been here, you know, and seeing the contrast that takes place with most people that are from here but have never been away from here, is that there's so many things they don't understand, how lucky they have it, and there's a lot of people that really fucking take it for granted. You know, and to hear the way that you reduce it down to something that's so simplistic but woven into the fabric of our society, you know, from its inception, you know, and to both realize and appreciate it the way you do is both remarkable and refreshing, because you just don't hear it put that way very often either. So, you know, I appreciate you sharing it. It's fucking great. One thing I like to ask everybody, especially people that are busy, how they manage their time. I mean, to me, that's kind of the textbook principle of how people get successful is they're efficient. I mean, whether, you know, wrong, right, or indifferent, like you can't get to where you're at, or most of the people that I interview wouldn't be where they're at if they didn't have some semblance of their shit together when it comes to time management. So I always like to ask people what their morning routine is.
Oh my word!
Given you know, you're not traveling, just a normal day around here. What does your morning look like?
Oh my gosh! So you hit the one thing that I really suck at, because I'm always late. I'm notorious for always being late, and it's a combination, I think, of the fact that I try to do everything I do properly. I always have. That's in my nature. I hate people who do things. I hate it when people do things, you know, they don't do it properly. I don't understand. If you're not going to do it properly, just don't fucking do it. Yeah. Okay? Just get the fuck out of my way, because you just wasted my time. If I got to finish what you did, and now, why did I bother? Yeah. Like, it's because now, on top of the fact that I still got to do it, now I'm pissed. So for me, you know, I try to do everything properly. I try to do it as the best that I can, and I try to get it all done. I'm not someone who, it has to be me. If I don't do it, it's not going to be. No, the better you are at everything, the happier I am. So on a day when I'm not traveling, I have to get up with my kids and get them to school. They got to be fed, and they got to have lunch. And also, have I read all those notices from school, and is the homework all in order, and all of that stuff. So as everyone who's ever had kids knows, getting them out the door in the morning is the first achievement. Actually, waking up is the first achievement.
Getting your own ass out of bed.
Because I'm not a morning person. Yeah. And also what I do is, when everyone's asleep, I work. Yeah. You know, and I can stay up for hours. So that's sometimes rough. Yeah. But it's funny that you say no one gets, you know, to do all this kind of stuff without having some degree of efficiency, right? Because someone said to me just the other day, you know, I said I was not disciplined at all. And they said, yes, you are. You know, there's no way you did all of this without having a degree of discipline. And I guess that's true. But to me, I'm always conscious of what I'm not doing well, and what I need to do better, and what I need, you know. So I never think of myself as disciplined or efficient. But what I do use a lot is, I like lists. Yeah. I'm a list person.
Yeah, I noticed even in the kitchen you got lists and shit all over the place. Yeah.
Yes, and my husband will tell you I do lists for him. Yeah, I don't doubt it. Which he doesn't like.
Yeah. I don't think any of them do.
No. Yeah. So that's what I would say. That's the one thing that keeps me grounded, is a list, at least something to go back to. I can't remember anything I see on my digital calendar. I do not know why. Maybe it's because the act of writing it down is how my brain really functions.
No, 100%. I mean, that's why I have a notebook instead of reading it off of a tablet or a phone or whatever. I write same
We're
thing.
old.
Yeah.
I was going to say we're old school, Mike, but let's face it, we're just old.
Yeah, I'll take the old school. But the efficiency thing, I mean, I guess the thing that sticks out to me that you mentioned was that you always feel like you're either not efficient or you're focusing on the things you could do better. I mean, to me, again, that's a personality trait I think that separates people that are successful versus people that are satisfied with the fucking status quo. They're like, it's good enough. Like the people that think shit's good enough stay in the same lot in life, you know. So I mean, to me,
and I've tried obviously as I've once you live a little. I mean, I'm 47 now, 48 this next month. I try not to be such a perfectionist that I create an impossible standard where everyone always feels like they're failing and torture myself. Do you know what I mean? I'm not stupid about it, and I'm not unreasonable about it. I've had to learn how to let stuff go.
True.
So if you know that you've done it the best that you can do it in that moment, and that it's going to work, and that you make it, you make a conscious decision that you've got to, all these other things to do to that level as well. Mm-hmm. That's what it means to me. It doesn't mean every single thing has to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, I come apart, which I think is an important distinction because I see it with my son.
Yeah.
He likes everything to be perfect,
like OCD perfectionist.
Tiny bit. Yeah. So I'm aware of I'm aware of that because I don't want him to live the kind of life where he doesn't get a whole lot done because he's always trying to do it perfectly.
Sure. Yeah.
Like I was terrible at drawing because I wanted my drawings to be perfect. And I spent so long trying to get them done. Everyone was always, the art project was over and I was still,
still trying to fix it. Yeah. I mean, like I said, to me, as with everything, there's happy mediums, but striving to always be better, I think, is a common denominator with successful people. No two ways about it. All right, so childhood-wise, obviously you grew up in South Africa. Can you kind of synopsize what that was like? Because I know most of the people listening, I mean, we do have people in South Africa and New Zealand, Australia, and Europe that listen to the show, but most of the listener base is in the States, and so I'd love to get kind of a synopsis or a chronological version of
okay, so I was born in 1971, so I grew up in the 70s, and at that time apartheid was in effect in South Africa, so that was a defining thing for me, really, the framework of my existence, I guess. I had parents who were both very, very smart and interesting, and also encouraged us to always have an opinion, So I think a lot of the values that I have, some things were innate because I was born with, a very soft heart and a big heart and a curious mind. That's the sort of the nature. But in terms of the nurture, I was raised in a home where people were treated with respect, and no quarter was given. You know what I mean? And also where consistency was a significant value. You don't get to be an asshole to people at work and then in your personal life you live a different kind of life and then claim that you're this kind of person. I'm an honorable person. Oh, except at work, I'm not an honorable person. You know what I mean? Sure. You got to be consistent. You've got to, if you say you believe in something, you actually have to mean it. And if you mean it, then you have to know what you're prepared to do to stand up for that. And we had a big family. I had a really big family. It may sound idyllic. It wasn't. My parents got divorced when I was 8. And remember the weekend, my dad moved out on Saturday or something like that, Saturday or Sunday. And the following weekend, he came to pick us up. And we went running down the stairs. My sister and I, all excited, jumped in the car. And there's this little girl sitting there. And I'm 8. My sister, I think, was 12. And there's this little 5-year-old blonde girl. And my dad's like, hello, girls. Say hello to your sister, Leanne.
No shit.
And we were like, hi. And that was the end of the conversation, right? No explanation given.
Jesus.
Here you go. So I had a crazy, wild, explosive, Sicilian upbringing, because my family gatherings were always, they very often went up in flames with somebody storming out, or more than one person. But I'm so grateful to my parents for teaching us how to be decent people and how to treat people decently, and also to know who we were. That's really, I think, probably the most important thing about my childhood. I always knew I was loved, and I always knew who I was.
Yeah.
And that nobody can take those two things away from you, right? They can't take that from you. And I think that above everything else in my life is why I've been able to do the things I've managed to do, how I ended up somewhere like 60 Minutes when I came from nowhere in Africa, because I know who I am, and you don't, people, when you're in Iraq or Afghanistan or Angola, Mozambique, Siberia, it really doesn't matter. Even Europe, people know when you're faking, and they don't like it. And respect is really important. It's the basis, I think, of everything in life. And when you fake respect, people know you're doing that too, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm not perfect. And even when I'm on television, to me, I'm not perfect. I don't look perfect. My hair is never perfect. I don't speak in perfect sound bites. But I'm always who I am, always. And people like that real. They know when something's not real, and it matters to all of us.
Yeah.
So that my childhood, if anything, I mean, Africa is beautiful. South Africa is gorgeous, and I grew up outdoors. I was a dive master. I almost became an instructor, but then politics got the better of me when the head of the South African Communist Party was assassinated, and the country went up like that, and I was drawn deeper into journalism. But I worked from a young age. I lied when I was 14, I lied about my age and got a job scooping ice cream.
Really?
Yeah. I loved working. And then I also started working as a journalist when I was 17. So I did that early too. But South Africa is a place of passion. African people are very passionate and alive. And place of the sun. I'm a child of the sun. I love the sun and the water. And I love people who are real. And then, of course, I had the greatest possible introduction to journalism too, because in South Africa we were all fighting for something that we believed was very powerful and noble and worthy. And that was for freedom and justice for all, and the end of apartheid and end of institutionalized racism in South Africa. And so that was everything to me growing up. And I worked constantly. I barely remembered a weekend from a holiday, from and anything else, because work for me wasn't just work. It was about life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, without a doubt, your parents did a fantastic job in instilling both a genuine nature and an authentic work ethic. I mean, you can see it in how you carry yourself and the job that you do, as long as I've known you, and even well before it, and just following your work. But I'm curious, two things, I guess. Number one is that in terms of the South African society as a people, would you say that most households are more that way than they are here? And secondly, if you had to contrast what it was like there compared to here, like what are some of the big differences growing up there?
So we only got television in like 1979.
Yeah.
So just think about that. And it would start at 5 p.m, and it would run for an hour or 2 hours. So there's so many things here that it's very difficult if you grow up with them to imagine what it's like being without them, right? What the similarities, I think, are that South Africans, like Americans, are doers, right? It's a younger country, part of the new world, and people are creative and innovative, and they do stuff. The biggest difference, I would say, of the most significant difference, because it affects so much, is that in the United States, you're at the center of the world. And you know that you're at the center of the world, and you're the world leader, and a lot revolves around you: international business, trade, and technology, and politics, and entertainment, and fashion, and money, and all of that. The United States is right at the center of it all, and you never you never doubt your own significance. I grew up in a place where we never doubted our own insignificance, because we're not at the center of anything. We're an afterthought, and I never minded that. I didn't grow up with a big chip on my shoulder. I just grew up with a yearning to go to the center and learn about it, and see what it was like. So that changes your perspective, I think, when you grow up far away and you realize, no one cares what happens ultimately in South Africa. We don't affect and change anything. It's part of the reason Mandela was so extraordinary, because the way he fought and what he did, the whole world paid attention. And that is unbelievable. It doesn't take a lot in the United States to get people around the world to pay attention to what you're doing. But when you are, in a place like South Africa, it does take a lot. So I would say that is very, very different. But what's also similar is South Africa is a very physical culture too. You're always outside. I was diving, or I was swimming, or I grew up doing martial arts. And so I loved that, because when I went to Europe, I went to live in Paris and work as an au pair, which is basically a glorified term for a domestic servant. I realized that Europe is a lot about taking a slow walk along the Seine, or sitting and having a cup of coffee, and in those days a cigarette and all of that. And I almost lost my mind doing that at age 17 and 18, because I wanted to go. And so I had to learn. I remember saying to myself, there's no point in wasting all this time in living in Paris looking for what you know from South Africa. You got to look at what's right in front of you. You've got to find the value in that. And that actually was a lesson that was very useful, because that's what I do in Afghanistan or Yemen or wherever it happens to be. Don't go there looking for what you know. Go there looking for what is there.
Sure.
Would
you say that type of both outlook and your upbringing was more common in South Africa, or would you say it was more of an anomaly, having that kind of...
So, it's so easy to answer a question like that and act as if you know the answer and your answer's worth something. But really, we're just guessing, right? How the hell should I know? I would say that because I don't know. I wasn't growing up in America at that time. I was growing up there. And I don't know what happened in every house here or there. But if I had a sense of it, I would say this country is just so different, right? It's just every place, every state. You can get a bunch of states along the East Coast that are kind of similar, from where you go from Massachusetts to New York to Washington, D.C., there's a lot that's similar. But look how different that is to somewhere like Colorado, right? Or entirely different to a small town in Texas. So I think it's hard to give a broad, general, definitive statement about that. I think you have both in the United States. You have people who are very motivated, who are unstoppable, and who live like that. And then you have people who are very inward looking and not looking out at the world and have a different kind of approach. But is that sort of motivation part of American DNA? I think my experience is yes. What do you think?
I would agree with you in that it varies so much here. I guess, for me, having never even been to South Africa, my curiosity lies in, does it seem like that's more part of South African culture, is being raised kind of with the same... when no one gives a shit about you, you got to make it happen. South Africans know they got to make it happen. That's sort of why how the country has survived. It's look at the Afrikaners, they're a white tribe, right? They're the descendants of the Dutch colonizers, Dutch and German and French Huguenot colonizers in South Africa. They don't exist anywhere else in the world. People look at them because they're white and say Africa's not your real home. But they literally don't. If Africa's not their home, South Africa, they don't have a home. Yeah. So that's a ridiculous thing to say. It may not have been their home when it was home to the Zulus and the Tswanas and the Peris and the Basotho and all the other tribes. But they were born, that soil gave birth to them. Yeah. They didn't exist outside of South Africa, and they still don't as a nation. So when that happens to you, and it's part of your survival,
I think it's it is in the DNA of every South African.
Yeah.
Is it in the DNA of every American? Maybe not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, to me, like I said, there's just there's too much variance from state to state, and just from a socioeconomic standpoint, some people, there just doesn't need to be,
Yeah.
for some of the same reasons that you had mentioned earlier, with it being kind of the center of so many things, that I think there's a certain amount of arrogance and complacency that comes with that, where there's not that sense of urgency and need or desire to make shit happen the way that there is in a lot of other places. And I think you see that, I'm sure you've seen it in all the places you've been. I know I have, and every other country I've been to, there is more of a sense of urgency in terms of life, and survival and getting things done and having to look out for yourself because nobody else is type of thing. That
Well,
again,
think about it this way, Mike. If you're, how many people have you met who've been very, very successful and overcome a lot to achieve something? Their kids are growing up having all those things,
Yeah.
right? And the kids are never the same.
Yep.
They're not as hungry typically as their parents. I mean, they're very often, it's hard to give your children a sense of that now when they've never been without food, to give them a sense of what it's like to be hungry, right? How do you do that? They have to find out on their own. They have to have their, time in their life where they don't know where their next meal is coming from. Mm-hmm. And even then it's not the same, because they're equipped with skills that they know this is temporary in some way, right?
Yeah.
This is not it. They have hope and a degree of certainty that they will move beyond this, which is very different from being someone who that's all they've ever known, and they cannot even see a way past that, because it probably is going to be all they ever know.
Yeah. There's with even in those situations, there's almost a subconscious safety net, I think, that exists that people are going to know that it's going to be okay.
Yeah, that's why I love to hear people say, like, especially in a place like, for example, New York, right? You got a lot of people who don't have a lot, young people who are trying to make it, or all the rest of it, and think they know what it means to be poor. You don't know what it means to be poor until you've been working as many jobs as a human being can possibly work, and you're still living in poverty, and you still can't provide for your children, and you still can't take care of yourself, and you know without any doubt that is exactly how life is going to be till the day you die.
Yeah.
That's a very different experience and understanding of poverty.
Then a few weeks of having,
or even years, a few years of sharing an apartment in New York and not being able to go to the fanciest restaurants. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think, like I said, I love that perspective from an outsider's viewpoint in terms of being raised outside this country. I think it's very valuable. So in terms of the school experiences, the grade school, elementary, junior high, high school, is that set up kind of the same? And is that in conjunction with the time that you grew up in South Africa, kind of what drove you and incentivized you to go into journalism?
I went into journalism because I love to write. I'd always been a writer. Sorry. And I was raised in a house of readers. Books were very, very important. Really, I guess a lot of life revolved around books. My father was subscribed to National Geographic. Mm-hmm. So magazines, of that nature. We were not allowed to touch the National Geographic magazines, which was super frustrating because you could use them for school projects.
It's like in America, Playboys, guys. Stay away from your dad's Playboy.
Oh, it's exactly like that. No, Mike. Okay, so that's funny that you mentioned that, because in South Africa, Playboy was like legendary, right? Yeah. Oh my word. Would you believe that in America they have this magazine and you can actually see naked women in it? And so we didn't have anything like that in South Africa when I was growing up. I'm sure they have it now. Yeah. We had a very tame version that once I was photographed for an article about diving, scuba diving. Okay, let's just be clear. I wasn't doing a nude or semi-nude photo shoot, but anyway, I ended up being in that magazine, which was not my finest moment, but one that generated a lot of not very good jokes from everyone who knew me and still does actually. Yeah. But books were and books and magazines were a big part of that. And you weren't allowed to deface a book. If you wrote on it or didn't treat it or handle it properly, that got you into trouble in my house.
Yeah.
And so that was a big part of it. But I went to a school that was, Winston Churchill was one of the board members at my school.
Wow.
It was founded by British lords and aristocrats. And actually, the best thing about my school was that we had a crazy headmistress. And when I say crazy, I mean it in a good way, because she, during the anti-apartheid years, allowed schoolgirls to skip lessons in the afternoons and go up to the university up the road and protest.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. So when these protests and marches and rallies and that would very often end in volleys of tear gas, right? So who would take that responsibility and liability on as a school principal? And anyone, you didn't have to, but anyone who wanted to could. And so that to me is really what defines the most important things about my education. So that I was lucky enough to go to a place that, in fact, even before that, the single most important thing was when education in South Africa was still segregated and there were schools for black kids and white schools for white kids. My school, being a semi-private school that had government subsidies but was mostly private, took the parents voted, and they voted to become multiracial, to have no racist requirements for qualifications for the school, and we forewent government subsidies in order to do that. So it wasn't just a vote; it was actually. It actually cost everybody financially, but it was that important to the people. And what I love about that is they're in apartheid South Africa, all white parents and all white kids and all white school, and they 10 years before education was opened up, in South Africa, across the border in South Africa, my school did that. So I went to school with black kids and Indian kids and whatever else. And that I think it's consistent with how I was raised.
Yeah.
And it was a big deal to all of us. We loved that. I mean, can you imagine as a kid, if I was friends with a black kid in my class, we couldn't go to the movie theater together.
Really? I mean, it's like, so back.
We couldn't go to the
like
beach together.
No shit.
Yeah, I could if I wanted to go to, beaches for black people, but that would have been controversial and risky and whatever else. So that brings it home to you, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, like it was in the 50s and 60s back here when it started to shift. But at what age did it shift for you when that vote took place? Well,
the most significant sort of events that sort of symbolized the end of apartheid were when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. That was just a big deal. And I remember as a young, what was that? Yes, I would have been a schoolgirl. As a young schoolgirl, the leader of South Africa at the time, P.W. Botha, was going to do this famous speech. And everyone was anticipating that Nelson Mandela would be released, because at that time he was, known all over the world, and he'd been in prison 20 years or something like that. South Africa had been subject to sanctions and was, feeling the pressure and all the rest of it. And I went as a young schoolgirl, maybe 14 or 15, 16 years old, to listen to this famous speech. And he did nothing that everyone thought he was going to do. He did not unban the ANC. He did not release Nelson Mandela. He dug in his heels and said, basically, screw you to the world. Yeah. And it was called, his nickname was the O Crocodile, which in Afrikaans means the old crocodile. And it was called the Rubicon speech, because he was expected to cross the Rubicon, and he did not. Yeah. And it was such a disappointment. So when I finished high school, I went and lived and worked in Paris. And when I came back from Paris, that was when, in fact, I came back for this because I didn't want to miss it. I came back, I was living in New York after Paris, and I came back from New York because we knew that the Prime Minister at the time, F.W. de Klerk, who pushed his predecessor out of office, was going to unban the ANC first and then release Nelson Mandela. And that was February 1990.
Yeah.
And that was still one of the greatest days of my life when the ANC was unbanned. If you can think of a Super Bowl party, imagine the entire country having a Super Bowl party. I mean, everywhere you went, people were honking their horns, people were cheering out the windows. It was just, I know there were pockets of South Africa, that may not have felt that way, but I can tell you now, they were few, and you didn't feel them. It was a celebration in the streets that went on for some time, actually. Yeah. That really was the beginning for all of us who had fought so long and hard and waited for that day. And I thought, okay, now's the day this is life. It meant life for all of us, black and white.
So it sounds like that was kind of the defining moment for the whole country then, as far as that goes.
Without question. That's why de Klerk shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Mandela, because people recognized that Mandela couldn't have done it on his own. It took a visionary like de Klerk who said, I don't want to inherit ashes. And it took exactly the same quality in Nelson Mandela, because he could have burned that country to the ground. I mean, literally, if his name was on the ballot paper, people would still vote him into office even though he's dead. That's the power that man had and has still, and but he chose to use it in a much more difficult way, right? He didn't do what most people would have done. Instead, he convinced Black South Africans that being together and building that country together was better than revenge.
Yeah. No, to me, it's hard. It's a great story to hear, and it's also hard for both me and I know most people listening that are from here to even be able to wrap their mind around what that must have been like. But that's incredible. So obviously that had a huge impact in terms of you getting into journalism. Can you walk us through kind of you graduate high school and now get into journalism?
So before I graduated high school, a woman came to speak to us about extra parliamentary political activity for women, which basically means outside of parliament and official government space, what women were doing in South Africa to fight apartheid. And there was a woman called Helen Joseph who had an organization called the Black Sash. And these women would wear black sash around their waists. And they would walk into protests and they would hold hands and shield people who were demonstrating from the police. And they did unbelievable work. And they were like, to me, as a young girl, seeing what they did, they were like angels. And Helen Joseph was the leader of that organization. And I went to speak to the journalists who came and talked to us about their work at school. And I said, I think I want to be a journalist. And I think this is what I've always wanted. And she said, well, come and see me at the paper where I work. And I'll talk to my boss and I'll see if we can, get you to help out at the paper. And I thought that was, unbelievable. And when I was 8, my English teacher asked me if my mother was picking me up from school that day. And I said, yes. And she said, well, don't leave the classroom. I want to go with you. I need to talk to your mother. I said, okay. And when my mother pulled up, Mrs. Anderson, her name was, she said to my mother, I just want to tell you that if this child doesn't become a writer, it will be a crime because she's really, really good. And so it was always in my head, that I would write. It was what I loved.
Even at 8? At
8, yeah. And although it's probably half the people I've worked with at 60 Minutes are saying, oh, God, she's really not that good. There's much better writers than her. It doesn't mean that. It was something that I was drawn to from very young. And then, so when I went into journalism, I went to a newspaper. I wanted to write. I wasn't thinking about television, to be honest with you, and I wasn't thinking about radio. It was the writing part of it. But I also knew that that the best writing comes from things you know about, right? Mm-hmm. Not the things you're making up. Yeah. So I knew I wanted to get out and see it for myself. I can't explain it to you. There wasn't a moment of clarity or a discovery. It was just absolutely 100%. I always knew that. Yeah. So I went to speak to the newspaper editor about working there in the school holidays. And I remember he had William Sanderson May had a cigarette dangling out one side of his mouth, and every other word was fuck, 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 fuck. And we always had a cup of coffee somewhere, and the newsroom was just a haze of smoke, cigarette smoke in those days. And from my first day, they expected me to report and write. And that's what I did. In fact, I wrote my first story on the back of a Peter Stuyvesant cigarette box with the butt of a pencil that some grumpy photographer fished out the bottom of his camera bag.
Yeah.
And I never looked back.
Yeah. So from that all the way up to 60 Minutes, I mean, has that road been, is it one crazy story after the next? I mean, because one of the, I think, expectations, at least myself, and I know a lot of us have listening that don't know jack shit about journalism, is that there's that paying of dues, and you go from here to the next step to the next step, and it's just, is that what that experience was like for you, or can you walk us through how that went?
So, I say the two most important things for me is people often come to me and say, I want to, do what you do. Translate. I want your job.
Yeah, but I want it right now.
I want it right now.
Same shit.
How do I do that?
Yeah.
So it was a little different for me because I wasn't born and raised here, and I didn't grow up. The system here is you start local, right? You go to a local paper or a local station or whatever, and you work your way up, and if you're lucky, you get your big break and you go national. South Africa is different because I grew up in one of the biggest news stories in the world, and there were a lot of foreign journalists, and that's how I made contacts and connections. So I came at it I didn't work my way up in the States, but I did do every job known to man. And I would, do the lowliest job and whatever job. And I still today would do the lowliest job, to be honest with you. I don't mind carrying boxes and making coffee and driving and doing whatever. But we didn't have union rules, which made things a little more, flexible. Mm-hmm. So in the US, I can't believe still sometimes we'd have to get someone to press the button on the machine and ask the editor if that was okay, if we did that, after they've gone home to sleep because we're still working through the night. Yeah. South Africa, that kind of stuff didn't, exist. So I did every job known to man. And I would frequently do 2-3 other people's jobs as well, just because I wanted to learn as much as I could. And if the guys at the weekend, when I was working weekends, if the guys had kids or wanted to go party or do whatever, I was like, oh, don't worry, I'll cut the story, right? And I'll write the story, and I'll satellite the story. You can go home, because I was young and I wanted to do it all. I did all the administration and paperwork and client services and everything for my boss with his name on the paper, because I didn't do it for credit. I did it to learn. True. And they didn't want to do it, and I didn't care. So what I did is I started at a newspaper. When I was 17 years old, I got my first job at a Sunday newspaper. And at one of the press conferences I was covering, I was talking to a journalist from the Times, Gavin Bell, from the Times of London. And he said, the best news experience you can get for hard news is at a news agency. So that's where you want to go, somewhere like Reuters or AP. But he said, don't stay too long. Yeah. That was his advice. Yeah. He said, those agencies are full of two kinds of people. People who are there learning, how to do hard news and do it better than anyone else. And those who stayed too long. Yeah. And they're bitter and they're really grumpy and unhappy. He said, don't stay too long. Yeah. Well, I loved agency news, right? I mean, I loved the news agency because every deadline is right now. Yeah. And I loved working to those deadlines and beating everybody else. I am a little competitive. Yeah. But also I loved you just immerse yourself in it and your story. You're like a beat reporter for 100 different beats. Mm. And that I'm always better when I know when I'm coming from a position of knowledge, right? I'm not good at faking it. It makes me uncomfortable. So at CNN, when I'm thrown on air and I had to be an expert about things I wasn't an expert on, and I had to sort of pretend, I sucked. So that wasn't my strength. So then when I went to college, straight after high school, I went and lived in France and worked and lived in New York and worked seeing the world. When I came back, I did my degree, and all through my degree, I worked at a daily newspaper. And actually, I would say I never applied for a job. I just always went there and forced the editor or whoever it was to see me, and then offered to work for free I said, when I was in college, I said, you got nobody my age on your stuff. You need a younger audience. Don't you need young readers? Let me work for you. And that's what I did. And people would pay me for what they used or pay me whatever they wanted. I never cared about money. I just didn't care about anything. I just wanted to do the job and do the work. So, and the other thing is I never went into television because I wanted to be on TV and be famous. I went into television because TV takes an army. You know, you need a sound man and a producer and field producers and runners and this and that. So when I went to the New York Times and other newspapers in South Africa, they've got their journalists, right? And then they've got mostly black people helping them navigate the townships and, you know, the black suburbs and neighborhoods and that, which was really where the story was happening most of the time. So they didn't need a little white girl working for them, right? And they had no interest in hiring me. So I ended up in television because Mike Cadman at CBS News told me to try Viz News, a news agency, because they hire lots of freelancers. And again, I just talked the guys there into letting me work. In fact, when I was sitting there, the cameraman who was the bureau chief was trying to write a story, and watching him type was just agony. And I said to him, hey, would you like me to do that for you? You know, because this story was breaking while I was there. And he said, sure. And honestly, that's the same thing I did at CNN in Atlanta, I don't know, 15 years later, when I went to go and see the news editor there. I did something for them. They said, thank you. And I said, thank me in person. You know, let me come and see you. And I flew myself out to Atlanta. And when the phones were ringing, I just started answering the phones because people were busy, right? Yeah. When first job I ever had for British television, a friend of mine in Jerusalem called me and said, hey, I heard that ITV is looking for a correspondent in Israel to cover the Second Intifada. You know, maybe you could do that. So I called them. I was living in London at the time. And I said, oh, you know, I'm in London on vacation, but I live in Jerusalem. And I heard that you were looking for someone there. And I slept on my friend's sofa for the next few months. They hired me for a few months. So, you know, people think nobody ever just gave me a job, you know, or gave me my big break or anything like that. Even today, it's still got to come from me. You know, if you expect it all to happen, if you think, oh, I've graduated college now somebody owes me a job, somebody owes me an opportunity, somebody owes me something. My mother and father raised us, you know, to understand that nobody owes you anything and the world doesn't owe you a living, right? You get out what you put in. True. And so I made all those things happen along the way. And sure, sometimes I got lucky, but they, you know, Richard Butler, one of the guys I work with, always says, I say to him, it's better, you know, we try to make smart decisions, but sometimes we just need to be lucky. And he said, you know what? I find the smarter I am, the luckier I get.
That's a no-shitter. So, I mean, for me, one of the things I'm curious about is where all have you lived in different organizations have you worked for? I mean, does that take you 20 minutes to outline that? Or
no, I'll give you the quick version is after I worked in all these newspapers and then got into television by going to Reuters news agency, which was Viz News. I loved that. But I realized I was working for a man who basically had maxed out, let's just say. And he was not very good. And I'd reached that point where I needed to leave the news agency or I was going to be one of those bitter people. Yeah. And it was hard. It was like severing a limb because it had been my life and soul. And I learned so much there and we shared so much. And there's a real brotherhood, right? When you're in the trenches like that with all the other people you work with. And we believed in it so passionately. But my boss treated me very badly the one day. And I looked at him and I said, you know what, fuck you. And fuck you, and fuck you. And I slammed the newsroom door as hard as I could, and I was disappointed the glass didn't break. Then I went into the next office and called my mother and cried. And then I got on a plane. Yeah. And I persuaded the American networks in London to hire me freelance. And I did like a couple of meetings, flew back to South Africa, packed up my life, and went back to London. And I worked in the beginning freelance at ABC and CBS. Mm-hmm. No, CBS and NBC. And then I was hired to work on the CBS, the ABC news desk. I did that for like a year. That was torture. I used about 1/1,000,000th of my skills and abilities, but I wasn't going to walk away. I wanted to show people when they looked at my resume to know that I was committed, that I'm not someone who just like flits in and out. So even it was really hard and really boring, and there were a lot of horrible people making your life hell, I stuck it out for a year. Then I went and ran around Siberia and a bunch of places like that doing a TV show for some production company. That was a joint production for Sky News and Fox News Entertainment.
Some crazy shit. Fucking Siberia.
That was fantastic.
No shit.
6 weeks living with the Chukchi in Siberia.
Yeah,
and I think that was like 1996. Oh my word. Yeah, going whale hunting and doing all kinds of stuff. So I loved Siberia, when I got to Russia, I was like, oh, I like these people.
Yeah.
These people, they're white Africans. These are my people.
Yeah.
They're like Africans, but they all happen to be white.
Yeah.
I was like, in a way, I'm home here because this kind of craziness is very familiar. I get it. The British are very, sort of passive aggressive and polite, and Americans are
obnoxious.
No, Americans can be obnoxious, but I don't buy into. I don't buy completely into all of those cliches and stereotypes. So then after that, I really wanted to work at CNN, and I wrote to them sort of every month for like 2 years. And I ended up freelancing for the European Broadcasting Union and getting a shot at CNN. Then I realized very quickly that it wasn't the place for me. And I took a job with an international aid agency. Because I was on the Albanian border during the refugee crisis during the Kosovan War. And I worked for that agency, the International Medical Corps, doing humanitarian work for a year. And that was the only time in my life that I ever confronted the question of whether I really wanted to be a journalist. Up till that point, every step I took was a step towards being a better journalist and doing the work I wanted to do as a journalist. And I wrote for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, one of the things I'm most proud of in my career. Love that newspaper. I love that newspaper. Love the way they are. I love the professionalism and the ethic there. And when I was an aid worker, I would write for the journal. We were doing medical work in mental institutions in Kosovo, and I would write about that for the paper. I never knew what I got paid. I got paid almost nothing. Sometimes I would phone news organizations and just offer to file for them and never get paid. I filed for the South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC. I never ever worked for them. They never paid for me. I filed for them whenever someone said yes on the end of the phone.
Yeah.
And then I decided, okay, aid work, very noble, not for me. Yeah. So I need to go back to being a full-time journalist. And I applied for the only job I've ever applied for with a job application, which is at British Television, GMTV, in London. And at my interview, they asked me if I could name any of the anchors. And no was the answer to that. I'm ashamed to say. I couldn't, except there was only one person I knew there, and we talked about him a lot. But they were like, okay, besides Martin Frizzell, this guy, who else can you talk about? And I couldn't name anyone. And then they said, okay, what about correspondents, not just the anchors? Couldn't name anybody. I walked out of that. Wow. I phoned my husband at the time, and I said, you know what? I'm not going to get that job, and I don't deserve it. Because I did no preparation. And who the hell do I think I am, rocking up for a job interview without knowing the first thing about that place I knew them because when I worked at Reuters, they were a client. So I knew them from that point of view. But I just knew they did the news, and I know what the news is. I know what journalism is. Yeah. So that's what I figured was the only qualification I needed. I got that job.
Oh, shit.
As it turns out.
Did you ever ask them what?
No, that was too embarrassing. I never wanted to go back there. But what that did for me is they didn't have anybody like me, but they recognized the value of journalism. They hired me for that. So they let me just do that all over the world. And I did the floods in Mozambique. And that's why when 9/11 happened, that's where I was working. And I said, let me go to Afghanistan. And they were like, no, it's too dangerous. And I'm like, let me go, let me go. And what I did is I started working on how to get into Afghanistan because I knew I was going to do it ultimately. I was one of many journalists who knew instantly that on 9/11 that it was Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We knew he was in Afghanistan, and I knew that was where the story was going. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. And I ended up going for GMTV to Afghanistan and living on the front line with Afghan soldiers and reporting on that war, the lead of every broadcast they had every day for 3.5 months on my own. And after that, the BBC, 60 Minutes, NBC, everybody, I could have had any job I wanted anywhere. Yeah. And I chose 60 Minutes. Yeah. That's how I went there.
Yeah. So that 3.5 month period, I mean, was that just the fucking Wild West? I mean, because I know when we first met, I mean, just some of the very casual stories that I remember hearing, you know, usually around a table with a few drinks involved with, you know, a bunch of former teammates and whatever involved. But just some of the shit that you've been through there, I was just like, you know, whether it's writing a book or just telling stories, like you have more of them than most guys I know that have spent a fuck ton of time there, you know, like what, and to me, like what I really want to expose the listener to is some of those that I found my jaw fucking wide open here, and like you went through all of that. Like, I mean, whether it's smuggling yourself in via taxi cab to, you know, through into Iraq, or just all that stuff. Like, I would love to get you know, some of that insight as to what those 3.5 months were like, and then subsequently after that, the time that you've spent over there, because you've arguably spent more time than probably anybody I know in those regions. You know, I mean, which is saying a lot.
Well, you know, wow. It just, those 3.5 months in Afghanistan were very hard, but they were also like some of the best time I've ever had on earth in my life, you know, because this was it. This was where I was doing everything I ever wanted to do, and doing it at the moment when it mattered. Sure. And I remember my sister told me that my mother said to her after one of my calls from Afghanistan on that trip, you know, I don't understand what I did wrong and why she's so, you know, messed up that she feels like she has to go to such a terrible place and expose herself to such terrible risk. My sister said, what are you talking about? Did you hear her voice? Like, she's happier than she's ever been. And it's not because I'm messed up or anything like that. In fact, it's a profoundly sane, grounded decision for me. Because it's in those moments where no one's asking what your hair looks like or questioning what you're wearing on television, right? They're just so happy to hear that you're still alive, and you know, hear your voice on the other end of the phone, that you can file. It's absolute freedom in your work, because you can file the stories exactly as you find them, and no one, you know, in New York is going to mess with you, because they're just happy you're still alive, and that you've actually managed to meet your deadline, which is, you know, the other challenge. So to get into Afghanistan was very hard, because the Taliban had 95% of the country under their control, firm control, right? And we forget very quickly, but that was when they were hanging women and executing women in the soccer stadium, right? In front of everyone, just for wearing shoes with a buckle that was too shiny when the sun caught it, or a sliver of flesh showing underneath their burqa. You know, that was, it was very frightening. And the Taliban were this big evil that was very intimidating. And the Afghan government in exile, which was really the political representatives of the you know, Northern Alliance, as they were called, they were a force that you still had to deal with. So I realized I had to get from London, I had to get to Germany where they were based, to get a visa from them, so that you at least had a piece of paperwork that could in some way maybe cover your butt if you needed it, right? Or at least without that piece of paper, I was screwed whether I was in Taliban territory or their territory. So I had to get to Germany and get that. I had to get into Moscow, because the best way into Afghanistan then was from the north, or whether it's one of those northern states, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, right? So I had to get, and you couldn't get to those places without going through Russia. And I had to do it fast, because 9/11 had just happened. And I spent the first couple days and one night in a prison on the French-English border following Afghan refugees. before my bosses would finally agree. I wore them down, and they agreed to let me go out there. So first to Germany, get that visa, then come back. Persuaded a guy in the Russian embassy in London to meet me at a cafe and give me my visa over coffee because he said it would be weeks. I said, no, brother, I need this in like hours, okay? Flying to Moscow tonight. Got to Moscow at 4 a.m. I realized when I said to my cameraman, Martin, do you have the carnet? And that's a piece of paper. If you've ever worked in Africa, you know you ain't getting a single thing across the border without that piece of equipment. And I knew that Russia was a carnet country. Mm-hmm. And he said, the what? And I was like, fuck. Okay, I know how this is going. Yeah. So I rearranged my underwear over the video phone and the other equipment that we needed, like the satellite phone. Yeah. And I suggested to Martin that we go through customs separately. I hid the stuff, the basic survival equipment that I would need to survive and deliver, still be on television. I took, and I let him take all the other equipment. And yes, lo and behold, everything was impounded. He came through customs with the shirt on his back, and I sailed through with everything I had. And by the time we got to the hotel, now we haven't slept for like 3 days, right? He found out that his father had a heart attack. And my boss phoned me and said, okay, Martin's going back. He's got to turn around and come back to Scotland, where his dad lived. He said, do you want to wait for a replacement, or are you going ahead? I said, you're out of your mind. I'm not waiting, right? There's no way I'm waiting. And I had to get from Moscow to Tajikistan. For some reason, there were a gazillion people trying to do that, along with 2,000 journalists, and nobody could get on a flight. So I went to Tajik Airlines, and I persuaded the secretary, to let me go into the head of the airline's office. And I don't even really know what I said, but I ended up hiring his nephew as my translator, and bumping someone off a flight and flying a few hours later to Tajikistan, where his nephew was standing on the runway with a bunch of very pathetic looking little flowers for me. And going to a press conference the next day with the Afghan foreign minister in exile, and one of the journalists saying that his network was the only one not represented, and mine is not represented in your country, sir. And can you help me with that? And Dr. Abdullah said, oh, yes. And then I said, and my network, which was my morning TV show, right? Yeah. So Dr. Abdullah was flying into Afghanistan the next day, and he agreed to let us go with him. And we met. It was a team from CBS, and there was this guy from British TV, and there was me, and Matthew Chance from CNN. And this helicopter was a mess. It was one of those old Russian makes, and had crashed several times and literally been soldered together. It still had some holes in it and some cracks, more than a few, and it was totally overloaded, so it couldn't take off. It kept getting like this high off the ground and then crashing back down. So every time I did that, we threw equipment off, and of course, I was alone, right? Everyone else had a team of people, so my equipment was the first to go off. So when they threw my video phone off, I said, motherfucker, okay, if you throw that off, that's fine, but then you're doing my live shots, because without that, I couldn't, be on television. And this British guy agreed, okay, fine. He had an Irish cameraman, Sean Swan, one of the best conflict cameramen, one of the best cameramen, best guys ever in the world. And Sean said, okay, if you do that, so you got to keep your word. He said yes, having no intention of keeping his word, but Sean held him to that promise. And eventually, we got off. There was nothing in the helicopter, and just a wooden chair for Dr. Abdullah, the foreign minister, with a red cushion on it. And we all sat at his feet without gear. And every time the helicopter lurched, the chair would fall over, and he would fall on top of us. We would put him back in the middle. And he was going to Hajabauddin, which was just across the Afghan-Tajik border. And, of course, everyone wanted to go further. So they're like, Lara, you ask him. Lara, you ask him. Why? Because I'm the only girl in the helicopter, right? And he said, sure. I said, Dr. Abdullah, please, we're so grateful that you've, brought us here. Because you don't know, at this time, journalists are, like, going on horseback across the Hindu Kush, right? People are taking, it took me only days. some journalists still spent, weeks and some of them even months trying to do.
Yeah.
And I said, we really need to go as close to the front as we can. He said, sure, no problem. So he spoke to the pilots, and then Hajibauddin, he hops off the helicopter, and we've now got 2 Afghan pilots who speak no English, and they just keep flying. We have no idea where we're going. Absolutely no idea. And it got darker and darker and darker until it was totally pitch black. And I tell you, I never forget those pilots flying just seamlessly in total darkness through the mountains and the mountain passes. And we landed at the side of a river, and there was a noose hanging from this bridge. And I thought, oh, well, if it goes wrong, I know where they're going to hang my body. And a bunch of Afghan men who took all of our stuff. And I spent my first night in the country with about 40 or 50 Afghan men sleeping on the floor with them in this little house.
Jesus.
And then persuaded them to get me down to the front line, and then ended up living with the Afghan soldiers because I didn't want to be miles away when the bombings were happening, right? And then I'd lived with them for so long at that point that when they did take Kabul, they took me with them.
Yeah.
And then once the city had fallen, it was, in fact, I went back many times with those soldiers who then became, the commander became the police chief in Kabul.
And so for this whole time, I mean, when you're embedded with them, what was that like in terms of how they treated you? I mean, did they respect you? Did they not respect you? Was there some hairy times where...
Well, here I am. I'm like a 20-something-year-old woman on my own, right? In a country where the Taliban had been in control for like 8 years, and women did not appear in public ever without being in a burqa. And most of them, I'd say 90% of the time, 98% of the women stayed behind the walls of their home or compound. Yeah. You just didn't see any women. It was very, very dangerous, and it was very scary. And the Taliban tortured. They lived, through a reign of fear, and they tortured women, right, psychologically and physically, and there was no quarter given, right? I mean, it was instant justice. I mean, the vice and virtue police, policing every inch of territory that they owned. So for me, it was really odd. The commander there had been trained by the Russians, and he was a little westernized, and he spoke no English. Hello, please, thank you. In fact, I spent months teaching him how to say, I want peace and stability in my country. That was what he used to. That was his one sentence. And he actually did used to say it to the journalists who came there. Yeah. But he didn't want me to wear a burqa or, a headscarf or anything, because he wanted to show that he was Western, and he had a little girls' school there. And he assigned one of his personal bodyguards to be my bodyguard, who spoke no English whatsoever. And that was... I didn't know which way it was going to go. I just had to go with my gut that this guy had more to gain keeping me intact than not. But the first night I slept in this little mud place on the front line, and his soldiers woke me up in the middle of the night, with their hand over my face, like a stinky, dirty hand, by the way. And like they're this far from your face, and they're all, they all got their weapons and all that, and they're like, come, because no one speaks English. And I'm like, oh shit, is this like a late night booty call for the general, right? Like, how screwed am I right now? Yeah. And you're walking along there to his shitty little mud compound. And you're like, you don't know. Yeah. So you're hoping for the best and trying to prepare yourself for the worst. And actually, what we did for the next 3 months was just get face drunk every night. With, by the way, at a certain point, with a lot of Taliban commanders who would drive their cars up from Kabul at night or come across the front line to negotiate. And
they would get drunk?
Absolutely shit-faced. Yeah.
Fucking irony with that.
Yeah, no, it was like crazy. And also, they only had like teacups, right? Yeah. So they always wanted me to drink first, and I was not a drinker. Yeah. So no one would drink until I drank first. So I would sneak my cup like this, and my bodyguard would drink most of it for me. But it didn't take a lot to get me really, 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 really drunk.
Yeah.
So, and then they would try to persuade me to go back to Kabul with the Taliban guys. And every time, and I was like, no, like, that's not necessary. I'm good here.
Yeah.
So, living with the soldiers, I built relationships, which really count in Afghanistan. And the day, I saw a lot of stuff that I've never spoken about, and a lot of stuff that I didn't report on, because my agreement with the commanding officer there was that I wouldn't tell anyone that I knew that the Americans were conducting airstrikes and operating from Afghan soil, because officially we weren't there yet.
Yeah.
And the day of, actually, I would go down to the front line. I was running through fields of mines, Mike. I had no idea. But my bodyguard, his older brother, was one of the top fighters, and command is the most experienced guys there. And so he was really leading those positions on the airfield. And we would go down to him at night, his little brother and I, and he would show me the rockets and the mortars and say, like, which one tonight, and then they would shell the Taliban. They would shell us back, and then they would shell. And all he wanted was a bottle of whiskey. That's what he dreamed about. Khawni, Commander Khawni, he just was killed, actually, in an ambush with all of his bodyguards. Like 17 of them, they just laid waste to his entire...
Just here recently.
Just like a month and a half ago.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. So Khawni had fought in every war. And you want to know what's so fascinating about that? The day of the advance, when they actually did move on Kabul, Khawni had made, and the general devised this plan. They'd made deals with the local Afghan Taliban, and Khawni had all these little units, and he sent his guys in. The Afghan Taliban let them slip in quietly, and they attacked from their own side. They attacked the Al-Qaeda guys, so all the Pakistanis and the Arabs and all of them. And as they tried to flee, the Afghan Taliban, who they were fighting alongside, mowed them down.
Jesus.
And then Khawni's guys skinned the bodies. The Afghan Taliban and Khawni and these guys, they all skinned the bodies. I went into the trenches and saw the skinned bodies. That's how I know. I saw it with my own eyes. But actually, when they did that very quiet deception, which was what was the beginning of the move on Kabul, I wasn't allowed to be with Khawni, and so his brother and I listened to it on the radio. And at one point, they had 12 Taliban prisoners. How do I know? Because Inayat held up the number of fingers, and you could hear them. I could hear Khawni like yelling at these guys and talking to them and asking questions. And then I heard one guy spit. And this prisoner spit in Khawni's face. And I said to Inayat, like, what's happening? And he showed me, like, in the face, And then I heard 12 shots. and it was like, okay, no more prisoners, So that was really fascinating for me. But when we were allowed to move, when they started to advance on Kabul, and the general let me go in there, some of the soldiers wanted a picture taken with me, and some guy came out of the crowd and grabbed my breasts in front of everybody as we're standing having our picture taken, me and like 5 Afghans, and there's hundreds and hundreds of soldiers around us in the advance, and the general stopped everything, because I didn't think about it. It was just, I did what I would have done in a bar in New York, and I tried to hit this guy as hard as I could, but he just did a drive-by. So all I got was the back of his head as he started to disappear into the crowd. And I remember his head, I just connecting with the back of his head, but unfortunately not properly. And this guttural scream came from my belly. Like, I was just angry. It was a real rage. And, in Afghanistan, that was an absolute humiliation. To be humiliated like that in front of everybody was a big thing, and a stain on my honor, and it also put me in a very, very bad position. But I didn't think about all of that at the time. I just was so angry to be treated that way. And the guys who knew me so well, because they'd been around me for 3 months at that point, were very upset for me. I was like a sister to them. And And I was like, that motherfucker, like, where the fuck is he? I am not putting up with this. And I lost it. So they ran to get the general and Babajan, and he stopped everything. And he sent parties of them out, pickup trucks. Guys went out to find this guy who had at this point run away. And they found him and dragged him back to my feet. I stayed with Babajan, the commander, after that, because I didn't, I was feeling a little exposed and vulnerable. And he pulled his pistol out and put it to this guy's head and was like, yes, no.
Jesus, giving you
I was like, fuck, shit. I mean, I'm pissed, but God, I don't want this man to be, hurt. I like to die, but now what do I do? Because in that culture, you've got to be very careful as a woman, because I would have been a military mattress in 4.5 seconds, and never seen the light of day. So I took the general aside, because I spent many, many hours with him every night and day. And I said, look, it's just like my heart, I can't do this. And even with very little English, he understood. And he said, don't worry, I beat him. And they took him away and put him in prison for a while. And I know he got a couple of beatings, I heard. But they did release him.
Yeah, Jesus. Well, so... like this whole time that you're rolling around, one, you're dressed in jeans and a t-shirt the whole fucking time.
Yeah.
How are you operating? Like, what are you operating on?
One pair of jeans, by the way, and like 3 t-shirts for like 3.5 months. Yeah.
I mean, do you have money? Are you using cash? Like, how are you surviving?
Like, I borrowed a lot of money from Steve Harrigan from Fox News. I think it was one day on the front line where Steve came past where I was, because I was on my own, and he said, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. And he said, I just realized last night that you've got my satellite phone, you've got my cameraman, because his cameraman, when he could, would do my live shots for me, so I didn't have to do them myself. Yeah. You have half of my money. He said, and I don't help people. He said, I'm not a helper. I don't help people. I don't even like people. How did this happen? I was like, Steve, I've got my live shot. Can I come talk to you about this afterwards? So, I just finagled a lot of things. And I didn't have a lot to give back. But like with the soldiers, I would give them aspirin or eye drops or tea or, the special Afghan special troops, their special forces who cleared the battlefield of all the mines. They came and slept in my little mud place, and I gave them bread and tea, and I stayed up all night talking to these guys, and I always gave a lot of myself, even when I didn't have a lot of things to give, and I always gave respect and time, and it counted for a lot, because nobody had a lot, and it always does, So I just basically, I winged it. And at one point, my boss did say, I heard from someone else who came out, because journalists would come to the front and they would go. It was only myself and Steve Harrigan and Joel who actually lived there, and I didn't live with them. And someone told me that my TV station in Britain had gotten visas for another correspondent and a cameraman, because I still didn't have a cameraman at this point. And I phoned the news editor, Malcolm, and I said, Malcolm, I hear you got visas for so-and-so and so. He said, oh, yes, we did. And I said, well, what the fuck do you think you're doing? And he said, well, oh, no, well, they're not coming out. And I said, good. I said, because let me tell you something. If you try to send someone else in here, I said, I'll have their fucking chopper shot down. I said, there's no other way in. And by the way, these motherfuckers, I'm like their sister now. They will shoot it down. Yeah. They're crazy enough. And if I want it done, they'll do it. Yeah. And he laughed. I mean, I don't think they could believe it. But I realized, of course, there's no real hot food. No real food, because you're in a war, and they didn't even fire the ovens up to make bread more than once every 2 weeks. So the bread was edible for like the first 2 days, and after that it was like a weapon. You could have stabbed someone in the face with it. Yeah. And there was no, there's no toilets or anything like that, and sleeping, in brutal conditions. I mean, I got so many bed bugs, I ended up in an Afghan hospital and passing out unconscious for 3 days, just from the antihistamines that the Afghan doctor gave me. But I was bites from head to toe. That was it. And someone kept waking me up. Sean Swan, the cameraman, kept waking me up saying, your office is on the phone. They want to know if you want to come out. And I would say,
Yeah.
So I just, you make do, just like a lot of people do, right? You just make do. And honestly, after doing covering civil wars in Angola and Mozambique, when you're in Africa and you're in a war, like really, there's no supply lines, there's no DFAC, there's no like American medics coming to rescue you. Like there's just nothing.
Yeah.
And Angola and Mozambique had both been at war for decades. So in those places, like there's no market where you've got a supply line from Pakistan and you can buy some Pepsi. Afghanistan in a way, it was hard. But for me, it was almost like luxury.
Yeah.
And journalists were dropping like flies. Yeah. But I was thinking like, well, I don't want to tell anyone, but this is not so bad.
Yeah. So in terms of the supplies, I mean, like what were you eating? Were you even eating every day or every few days? And what would you eat?
Biscuits, stale bread, Pepsi, Pringles, and cream cheese.
Oh, shit.
That's what I lived on. I refused to eat goat.
Yeah.
I used to say to the Afghans, motherfucker, I like you, and I do not want to disrespect your culture, but I am not eating that.
Yeah.
No and they, because they know that you respect them. They know that from all of their dealings with you. Yeah. So when you really don't want to do that thing that's so offensive, the people once says, oh, you got to eat the local food. You don't want to offend the locals. Yeah. So, but they didn't understand it, because for Afghans, the idea that you don't eat meat was
just foreign, beyond foreign.
Beyond foreign. Yeah. So they were obsessed with this. Yeah. Every Afghan I ate with, I had this conversation probably more than any other conversation. The two conversations I had the most were, when will the Americans bomb the Taliban? Because even when the bombing campaign started, they were letting the Taliban convoys out of Kabul every night. And why don't you eat meat? And so eventually I realized, wait a minute, I know what I got to say. I said, it's my religion. Yeah. It's haram in my religion. It's forbidden, and that made sense. Yeah. Then after that, people stopped asking me.
Yeah, then it's just a free pass because it's, Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the influence of religion in so many ways. And I mean, in all cultures, it's similar here, just in a very different way. But it's some fascinating details. So as that 3.5 months period kind of wraps up, and now you have essentially the golden ticket of being able to pick whatever job, and you go 60 minutes. Did you go from that point back to New York, or what happened at that point?
I was still living in London, and my phone bill for filing, I was filing for CBS Radio. That's what I did a lot when I was working for GMTV, because once the morning news was over, I was still a reporter, but I just didn't have anyone who cared about what I was learning and seeing. So Kimberly Dozier from CBS, Kimberly said to me once, she did a lot of radio. She was great at it and a big star at CBS Radio, and then at CBS Television as well after that. But she said to me, if you're ever anywhere interesting, I saw her in Ramallah in the West Bank during the Second Intifada in Israel. And she said, if you're ever anywhere interesting and there's no one else around, file for CBS Radio. So I was doing a lot of CBS Radio. And when Kabul fell, CBS ended up not having anyone in Kabul. So I had been reporting for radio, and I love CBS Radio. I got to tell you, that's like one of the greatest organizations I have ever worked for, and one of the most rewarding reporting I've done has been for CBS Radio, among the most rewarding. And so I filed endlessly for them. And I got kind of a cult following in places like Milwaukee, where people were listening to me on the radio, I loved it. And I would sit on the mud roof and, describe what it was like with the sun coming down and the lights of the Taliban cars and the convoys coming out, and what the Afghans around me were saying and doing. And it was really, I loved it. So at this point, when Kabul falls, CBS Evening News with Dan Rather gave me a week-long contract, and I did some work for them. But then their correspondent arrived and made it very clear that this annoying little girl around her was a pain in the butt
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, I've done what I need to do. So I said to CBS, look, I got a few more days left on this contract, but you don't need me. You got your person here, right? I mean, like what do I, like, after everything I'd lived through, I just did not need to be shit on by some snotty, other insecure TV person, right? It's like, come on. The only reason I wouldn't tell you is not to be unkind.
Yeah,
but other than that, I have no hesitation. Anyway, I went back to the UK, and in the course of the negotiations, I got myself an agent who's still my agent to this day, Carol Cooper. So one of the greatest human beings I've ever been lucky enough to know. Yeah. And persuaded Carol to see me, by the way, because that was no small achievement. Yeah. Since I'd never actually worked in America. And I was almost going to sign with NBC when Jeff Fager at 60 Minutes 2 at the time said he wanted to meet with me. And my agent said to me, if it was anyone else but 60 Minutes, because we're that far down the line with NBC, I was about to sign. And once I had that meeting, I didn't look back. I mean, CBS was the sort of natural home for me. 60 Minutes, because one of my strengths is the interview, right? Mm-hmm. And what show is greater for that than an interview-based show like 60 Minutes? Yeah. So it was a natural. I mean, I still had a long way to go in earning my place there, but it was a natural fit for me. Yeah. And also, I mean, who didn't want to work for 60 Minutes, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's like the varsity squad, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that was it, because I spent, stayed there. But it wasn't it in terms of the work and fighting to do what you want and all the rest of it. I mean, they didn't make it easy for me at CBS or at 60 Minutes.
Yeah. Well, and I know obviously you did a lot of other things, because after that, when the Iraq War kicked off, the story that you, if you're willing, if you can share it, of how being in Jordan, can you get into the details of how you started to cover that? Because you were still with 60, or obviously you were with 60 Minutes at that point.
I was with CBS News. I was new at CBS. I started with them on the first anniversary of 9/11 in Afghanistan, and the whole drumbeat of war, right, was in Iraq was ramping up, and so we all knew that's where it was headed. And I spent every minute of my day that I had spare lobbying CBS for me to be the person in Baghdad for that war. And no one else really wanted to do it, which I didn't realize at the time and is still a mystery to me. So I went to Iraq for CBS for the last few months, 3-4 months of Saddam Hussein's time as in power there. And what was really amazing to me is when I made that decision, I had no intention of ever leaving. Yeah. Once I decided that was what I wanted to do. But unfortunately, the team I had with me of more experienced men who had all been with CBS quite some time, except for the one producer, had no intention of being there through shock and awe and the invasion. Mm-hmm. And so they really worked hard to fuck me over and prevent me from staying. Yeah. And I had no juice, right? I'm a new young correspondent at CBS. And I was just mystified. They came up with every excuse in the book for why we should be pulled out. And none of that really meant anything to me. But what did mean something to me is Dan Rather said to me, I'm really grateful that you're there. So glad. But, there's a day when New York says, come out, where you've got to listen to New York. You've got to be smart enough to know that day. And basically the team decided that they wanted to leave, but they didn't want to say it. And they arranged a meeting with the CBS News president. And every day we're reporting, right? And it's getting closer and closer and closer to the invasion, and the fear level and panic and hysteria in Iraq is ratcheting up. Journalists are leaving every day in droves. I mean, it went from thousands of journalists down to maybe 100. Yeah. So every day there were fewer people, and the fear in the streets was palpable, and there was more and more pressure to leave. And I was still doing the evening news in the middle of all of this. So they tell me that there's a conference call with management on the roof. And I go out and they all saying this stuff, and I just keep quiet because the vice president at the time, Marcy McGuinness, she knew exactly my position because we'd had private conversations. And she phoned me after the conference call and she said, look, Lara, it's very obvious that all these guys went out, but they don't want to say they went out. They're embarrassed. And she said, I've got to make it easy for them. I got to pull you out because it's the face saving they want. And I was like, okay, I guess this is that moment Dan Rather told me about. I said, well, Marcy, is there any way I can stay on my own? She said, I'll talk to Andrew Hayward, the president. She came back to me and she said, no, Andrew said, absolutely not under any circumstances whatsoever. So I was still going to do it, to be honest with you, even though I said I wasn't. Yeah. But by the time I came off the evening news that night, they'd taken all of the supplies. They'd taken the tape that we used to cover, to put across the windows for bomb blasts to minimize the shrapnel. I mean, the debris. And they'd taken all the reserve water. They had the keys to the safe houses that we had already identified and set aside. They sent away all the local staff. So I had no vehicle. I had no drivers. I had nowhere safe to go. I had no food. I had no water. I mean, they fucked me, right? As much as you could possibly do, they fucked me. And I realized, okay, so the first planes are flying towards Iraq. And I'm here. I'd done all kinds of wars on my own at that point. Angola, in Kosovo, all of that. And I was fully prepared to stay there on my own. But I would have put myself in a position, the best possible position to cover the war. I, at that moment, was in the worst possible position. So I said, okay, I will leave with the guys. And we left, that was at 4 a.m. and they left at 6. And the planes literally flew over our heads. And I spent the next week or so in hell on the Jordanian-Iraqi border with, I don't know, a bunch, 20 men from CBS who all snored at the same time. And nobody was interested or even trying to get back. And CENTCOM warned me. They said, if you go down that road from Jordan, from Amman to Baghdad, we will obliterate you. We're obliterating everything on the road. And the Iraqis were writing TV on the roof of their vehicles to try to stop American bombers and all that. But I realized that our security, because this is when it became really, a thing for journalists to have security, who were saying it was madness to go down the road, and our CBS people who were saying it was suicide, they were all lying. Because I had my producer from 60 Minutes 2, not my news producer, was in Paris, and she was seeing French and German and other journalists going down the road. Plus, our CBS Jordanian person who he was sending money down the road to pay the Baghdad staff. So they were all lying. And I planted some false information with one of the other journalists to see what would happen, because I suspected that all of the security for the American networks were all just talking to each other and that they didn't know anything that was really going on. And sure as nuts, boy, that same information came back to me. One of the CBS people saying, oh my God, you know what we just found out? And I was like, oh yeah, okay, I see how this is. So I met another journalist from Sky News, and we built a convoy, and we drove. And when I crossed that, with CBS's permission, I had to go secretly to the vice president of news, and she secretly got the permission of the president of the network to let me go. And the night before I left, no one at CBS would talk to me because they were super mad at that point. I asked for money. They wouldn't give it to me. I asked for a small camera. They wouldn't give it to me. I asked for a satellite phone. They wouldn't give it to me. So eventually I had to call the vice president in New York, and she called the news president in London, and he had to order the CBS people to give me that. And no one even said goodbye. It was a very cold, night for me, and not knowing whether I was going to, make it back or not. But I had the only reason it was possible, I left out the most important thing. There's a man called Firas Ibrahim al-Samurai, an Iraqi, who came to me when I was in that shithole on the Iraqi-Jordanian border. He came and woke me up in the night, and he said, I want to talk to you. I was like, okay. And he took me outside, and he said, you want to go to Baghdad? Because everyone knew I was like a crazy person. And I said, yes. And he said, I will take you. And I said, for us, he had just started working for CBS, but he was amazing. And all of our illegal equipment in Iraq, like satellite phones and all that, was hidden in the walls of his family home in Baghdad. And he said, I said, for us, if you go, if they catch you, they'll kill you. And I said, they're more likely to kill you than me. And he said, a word you will know, inshallah, right? He said, this is my home. And if I'm going to die, I want to die in Iraq. I don't want to die here. And that is what made it possible, because for us, he knew the roads, he knew the language, he knew the people, he knew the culture, he knew everything. Yeah. That's all I needed was my wingman. And that's what we did. We drove through the fighting, through the war. I filmed everything. Vehicles were bombed out on the road. There were bodies, there were craters, there were a lot of his very uptight soldiers at checkpoints, and a lot of hysteria because, especially around Ramadi, that whole area in Anbar province where you go through when you come along that road, the Iraqis were in a bad position and they were taking a lot of casualties. So it was very touch and go, and they wouldn't let us continue down the road. So we had to go around Baghdad and go up to Tikrit and come down. And you remember they had all the tires around Baghdad at the time, and they were burning them. They put oil in them, they were burning them because all the black smoke to make it difficult for the American planes. So there's Baghdad. I mean, it's just surrounded with smoke, black smoke rising. The air is thick with smoke. All you can hear is the sound of the bombs dropping, and sometimes you can't hear, obviously, the bombers really well, but you can hear the A-10s and the miniguns, because they echo around the city and all those buildings. That sound, I never forget that sound. And a lot of the city's on fire, and the sun is going down. And when the sun sets in Iraq, in Baghdad, it's like God is lighting a bonfire on the earth, and people are still fleeing the city. So we were literally the roads out of Baghdad were just flooded with people fleeing, and on the road in, we're the only ones on that road. And the Iraqi army was on the march. So you have just convoys of artillery pieces, and I mean every heavy weapon that you can think of. And they were marching it out of there. And to this day, I don't know that anyone's ever found all of that stuff or knows what they did with it. They probably buried it in the desert.
Yeah, that, or I mean, I'm assuming some of it got fucking blown up on the way out.
Some of it.
But
some of it.
I mean, that was. I mean, there was a lot of elements of the war at that point where shit was getting three sheets to the wind. Not just.
Oh yeah.
I mean, everything. And so that.
Well, and then I spent the next few weeks covering that war on my own, and I was the lead on 60 Minutes too, and Sunday morning, and the evening news, and the morning news, and I was just me and for us until they shelled our hotel. The Marines accidentally shelled our hotel and killed some journalists that I knew, and injured one journalist, a cameraman who I'd worked with a lot. And then for us, and I had a big fight because he wouldn't help me go to the hospital to try and see if Paul was okay. And Paul was in an Iraqi hospital in the middle of the invasion where they had no electricity and no medical supplies. So I was not going to abandon him.
Did he get injured in that shelling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they hit the Reuters office.
Yeah.
And two people, a Spanish journalist and another journalist, Tarak Prostoik, they were both killed, and there were a bunch more that were wounded. And that was obviously that was a big deal for us. It was very traumatic. I helped to write the letter to Taras's widow and clean the blood off all of his equipment because it was to be sent back to his son, who was 8 at the time. So, but for us is still today one of the most important people in my life. And when I lived in Iraq for 5 years, almost everything I did of significance in my time there, he made possible, And when I was gang raped in Egypt, he didn't even phone. He just got on a plane. He literally drove to the airport and came straight to my house in Washington, D.C. and stayed with me at my side for 2.5 weeks.
Jeez.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you still talk to him all the time, huh?
Oh, yeah.
And does he still live over there?
No, it became too dangerous for him because of his work, but he still works there a lot. But, the last time I was there with him, I asked Hadi Al-Amri, who you will know, head of the Badakor Iranian-backed militia, about personally executing 2,500 Sunnis and read him from a diplomatic cable in the U.S., which said his preferred method of killing was to drill holes in their heads while they're still alive. Yeah. So for us, we all came under a lot of pressure on that trip. And he said to me, Habibti, this question. Wow, this question is a big problem for us. Yeah, yeah. So he has to be very, very, very careful, you know. Sure. But he is an asylum seeker in the U.S. He has his green card now.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Man, that's crazy shit. I mean, that entire 5-year period. I mean, what would you say your life was like in terms of the balance that you had to strike between doing your job and keeping your fucking sanity? I mean, what was it?
Well, first of all, a very successful American woman said to me once when I was interviewing her and I asked her about balance, she just laughed and said, of course I don't have balance in my life, right? Yeah. You don't. If you're living in Baghdad, you don't have balance. But the balance you're talking about is really more a question of how do you keep your sanity, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, because, I mean, were you going back and forth? Or
no. I just lived there.
Yeah, I mean,
when I left Baghdad, I would go to Afghanistan or Darfur. On one trip, I went to Darfur when they were slaughtering people there.
Yeah. I mean, because obviously we would go back and forth. I mean, that was maybe you'd call it a pseudo balance because sometimes it would make it worse coming back, but there's a break. I mean, to spend
I didn't want a break.
5 years, what?
I didn't feel like I needed a break. Yeah. I mean, to me, I don't know. I loved being there so much, and there's always something else to do. If the basis of doing your job well is to learn and know as much as you can, right? To collect as much knowledge and information and experience and relationships and everything as you possibly can. Every time you do that, it makes you better able to understand and to explain and focus on the right things and all the rest of it. That is that job is never done.
Yeah.
You never reach a point. I don't have defined targets, okay? This is my target. This is my operation. This is what I'm going to do. No, I mean, my job never ends.
Yeah.
So I would still probably be living somewhere like that if I hadn't realized that, at a certain point you actually have to stand still and have a family and build something else, right? You can't live on the run.
Yeah.
But I would have lived on the run.
Yeah.
If I could have.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can tell you're drawn to it for sure. But do you miss it? I'm assuming.
Yeah. Don't you?
For sure, I do. I mean, for me, I miss the camaraderie and the guys and the experience. But there's elements of the job that I frankly don't miss. I mean, a lot of it I do, but more than anything, I miss the men that I grew accustomed to being able to count on, no matter what was fucking going on. But for that bouncing back and forth period from the time you started that 5-year period, can you share a couple of harrowing experiences that you barely made it out of alive just in the Iraq and Afghanistan area of operations?
Well, how crazy is this? After the bombing campaign in Afghanistan, when I was on one of my many, many, many trips there, on the 23rd of November, I remember that, in the first year after the fall of Kabul, we were doing left seat, right seat, right. So the unit we were with from the 82nd, from the 10th Mountain Division, they were going out, and the new guys were coming in. So they were doing the handover, right? And we were on Lozano Ridge, which is named after an airman who died on that particular piece of ground during the initial fighting. And we had a big convoy, and our vehicle drove over a double anti-tank mine and was blown to shit. We went 12 feet in the air and 8 feet forward is where it landed. The vehicle landed, right? So you imagine what happened to us. We were like little rag dolls that are flying through the sky. But, and the guy next to me, Sergeant Michael Eichner, and Staff Sergeant Roy Mitchell was in the front. He lost his leg, and Eichner broke his back, and they were the most severely injured. I landed on my face basically and got buried under a pile of dirt and soldiers and weapons and car parts, and all that. But what's amazing to me is there were 12 of us in the back and 2 in the front, 2 soldiers in the front, 12 soldiers in the back, myself, and then 2 other journalists, Carlo Montali and David Rhodes from New York Times, and my cameraman, producer Jeff Newton. How do you fit so many people in a vehicle on a battlefield, right? You know that you only fit that in an open cargo, unarmored Humvee. Mm-hmm. We didn't even have armor on the vehicles. Mike, that's when you think back to that, compared to MRAPs all those years later, right? Yeah. Look what happened over the course of that war. I mean, that's just unbelievable, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, I remember the Humvees that we were in. Two of the 4 Humvees that my platoon was in didn't have doors on them. I mean, the meager accommodations were. I mean, sometimes it's hard to even imagine. Now with the technology that they have, but hearing that, I mean, running over that, I mean, how the hell did nobody even get killed doing that? Like,
we got lucky. I mean, that vehicle just went like flying through the sky, and I was unconscious for some time, and I remember I knew it was a mine because of my time in places like Angola and Mozambique, which were very heavily mined countries, and what I'd seen there. And also the sergeant had just said to me, the roads are heavily mined. We try to stay off the roads, but we were forced onto the road at that point. So it was a natural site for an ambush. And of course it was chaos and mayhem after that. But every gun on that convoy was firing. But we just kind of got lucky. And I remember I could hear them at a certain point. Everything was white for me, and at a certain point I could hear my name being called, and it sounded really far away. And then I heard someone else say, "Is she all right? Is she all right?" And Jeff Newton, my colleague and one of my best friends, said, "No, I think she's dead." And I thought, fuck, they think I'm dead. They're going to leave me here. And then I'm really going to be fucked because we're in Taliban territory, and we were staying at Shkin, which was at that time supposed to be the most dangerous part of the country. And so I tried to talk, and I had blood, pouring out of my mouth and nose and all that. So I was a little bit of a mess. And Jeff told me later that he was actually lying on top of me, screaming at me. He was this far from my face, and I could hear this vague voice somewhere in the distance. Yeah. But then, they kind of dragged me behind some ruins, and I was really, just bashed up, but not badly wounded. I mean, I still have cracks and things in my jaw and my teeth from the force of that. Yeah. But there were other times. I mean, in Baghdad, our hotel was blown up underneath us, and 13 people died, including a 5-year-old girl. And that time, I'd been up all night, and I'd finally fallen asleep around 6 a.m. And I remember when I woke up thinking, oh God, I really am so tired. I really want, and I just swung my feet off the bed and put them down, and the bomb went off and destroyed the first 3 floors. We were on the 2nd floor, so we were lucky. But I remember thinking, shit, I'm in my pajamas, like of all the times for a bomb to go off. Now I can't go on TV in my pajamas. Yeah. This is gonna be hard to explain. But I've been in other situations, like in Iraq, actually, in Ramadi, where I was on patrol with Marines, and when you could, all the optics were changing, we knew it was bad. And Ramadi at that time was so bad. I went there because more Americans were dying there than anywhere else. Yeah. And we had to run across, going through the city. So we were hiding behind buildings, but there was a road. And so we do as, the Marines would take a knee and you tap him on the shoulder, he runs. And I tapped the guy, and he ran, and he took like 2 steps, and they shot him in the leg. So they were set up at that point. That was not a great, that we were right in the kill zone of a pretty intense ambush. So I had just, I just watched him drop like that, and then we had to get him back. So that was a sticky one. Yeah. But I have to say one of the worst was in the battle for Mosul. because we were surrounded by ISIS positions. We were with Iraqi counterterrorism forces right at the front as they were, and then we were inside the city. But ISIS still had at least 70, 75, maybe 80% of the city at that point. And we went to where they just gotten. We were trying to get to where they had taken a couple prisoners, and that our building had already been hit by a suicide bomber in a vehicle-borne IED, which was packed with one of those armor-piercing, insane bombs. Just a traveling. It's like a truck just filled with explosives and a suicidal lunatic behind the wheel. Yeah. So when that had hit the building the day before, and that's you either get lucky there or you don't, right? Yeah. And if you don't, it's really, 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 really bad. So that next day, and we were trying to get to those prisoners, and either a marksman, everyone says sniper, but I think they throw that word around very loosely, right? Yeah. Let's just say someone with a long-range weapon who was very determined was following every footstep we made, and that was one of the worst feelings, because it's one thing to be in an attack or an ambush where there's a lot of shooting going on and there's a lot of targets, but when you're running from building to building or cover to cover, and as you're running, that sound.
Yeah, I think the psychological impact that has is much more profound than the hornet's nest being kicked over of an ambush. Because it just seems like it's much more personal.
Well, also it was a holy fuck. This motherfucker is actually following me, and I'm tired. My body's slowing down. Wait, what's happening? The adrenaline is not propelling me forward like a gazelle. In fact, if anything, I think I'm fucking slowing down, and I actually think I can't breathe.
Yeah. No, it's the experiences that you went through there are there's thousands of them. There's one that I remember that you touched on years ago, and I'll probably fuck up the recollection of it, but it was something to the effect of a certain male that was in a position of power that was trying. I think he was trying to kidnap you. Or could you share that one before we move on?
Well,
to the
that
next
was a tricky one, because he wasn't so much trying to kidnap me as trying to sleep with me. So he was in Basra, and Basra at that time was. And still is really Iranian controlled, right? And so the Iranian militias were really the most powerful force down there. And for some reason, they were targeting women. And there was, there were just dozens and dozens of women being murdered every week. And the bodies were just piling up for offenses such as wearing makeup in public and that kind of thing. So they had the big, what they called the death mosque of Basra was pretty much in control. And, the Mehdi army, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mehdi army was strong down there at the time. And we went down to the death mosque to interview the imam. And that was intense because I had to be covered from head to toe. And when I say covered, I mean covered in traditional conservative black robes, not the cute, Bollywood kind of, headscarf and gold glittery sort of, flowing sexy. No, this was like,
not the vanilla Muslim.
This was the black tent from hell, because it is 100 million degrees, and I was sweating like a beast and dehydrated beyond anything. So my head is pounding, everything in my body is pounding. I'm trying not to vomit, and if even so much as a single hair escapes, they stop the whole interview, and all these very intense, unsmiling, men. Who don't want to look at you in the eye because it'll make them dirty, they call in this band of women who will come and adjust the headscarf and all the rest of it, and they'd admonish me in very serious tones, and the imam was just the most painful interview, because he was lying about everything, and B, he was when anyone starts an interview with a religious intonation, that every answer is going to be very, 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 very long. Plus, you're going through translation. Yeah. So it was tough. And at one point, I realized, wow, this guy actually does understand English, because he's starting to answer the questions before the translation is finished. So I told him, why don't you just stop fucking around? And if you feel like you actually want to answer one of these questions honestly, we could just start the interview again. How about we do that? And my translator's like, I'm not translating that. And I'm like, that's okay. This motherfucker speaks English just fine. He knows exactly what I said. Yeah. Anyway, the Iraqi commander who let us stay with them down there on this very dangerous trip had a little infatuation with me, I guess you could say, and would make me come to his bedroom at night and wear his pajamas and drink whiskey with him, and he would always make sure there was porn on the television, so I would like beg one of the guys to come with me. But you know,
is it like a Western porn?
I'm not. I've tried really hard not to look. So I would comfortably tell you that I have no idea. But it doesn't sort of take much to identify that as as the fleeting glance. Yeah. And people would say, "Well, why would you be there? And how could you put up with that? And whatever." He was. That was our safety net, right? I mean, that was keeping all of us alive. So I didn't really have a whole lot of choice. And that was the downside, but there were also the upsides. Like, you had food and you had protection and all of that. So anyway, one of the guys I've worked with a lot, who's one of my closest friends in the world and one of the best journalists I've ever known, Richard Butler. We negotiated with our Mehdi Army contact, General Falcon was his code name, self-given, by the way, not given by us. We had negotiated with General Falcon access to Muqtada al-Sadr, that was a big deal at the time, because the fight in Najaf with the Americans and all the rest of it. So Sadr was a big deal, and he hadn't done any interviews with anyone. And Richard said to me at the last minute, "Let me go down to Basra and clear the way, make sure everything's okay." And I said, "Well, I want to go with you." And he said, "No, it's my job to make sure that we're good here. I'm not bringing you in till I'm satisfied that it's good." So, and if you know Richard, it's hard to argue with Richard. So I gave in. And unfortunately, on that first trip, that Iraqi general he'd come and pound on my door in the night. So that was a little more disconcerting even than having to wear his pajamas. And Richard, recognizing what was happening, stacked all the camera cases that he could outside my door and would sleep on them at night. And, you never know for sure. But we were told by people who had the ability to track these things that had been an ongoing issue for that particular individual who was actually working for the Iranians, even though the British and the Americans thought he was working really for them and for Iraq. So when Richard went back down there to do that story, he liaised with that individual who we thought was, a trusted person, a safe person. Yeah. And he basically had the Iranian militias. He sold Richard out to the Iranian militias who took him that night, him and our Iraqi fixer, from the hotel and imprisoned him for 3.5 months and chained him to a radiator. And at one point for 3 days, put him inside a wall and plastered the wall around him. So
no shit.
It was, that was... not an insignificant event in all of our lives.
Yeah.
I mean, even though Richard made it home to this day, he has a lot of problems with his shoulder and other things. But he did send me a photograph a few months ago, because that was years ago, right? He sent me this thing on WhatsApp, which had a big picture of a double-layered chocolate cake with candles and everything. And it said, "Avoid kidnapping, eat more cake." and Richard's note was, "Thanks for fucking telling me."
Man, it's, again, it's just every story you have it could be its own fucking movie. But
oh, don't worry. When Richard was hostage and he came to Baghdad and he promised me he had information and we didn't know he was involved. I mean, he Richard's best friend and Jeff Newton and I went to meet with him, and let's just say there were some interesting things. I mean, he drugged us
through the booze, or
and I thought I was funny stealing Jeff's wine, so I got like a double dose. That was another night that almost ended very badly in Baghdad.
Jesus, the time that you spent there. And obviously hindsight's 20/20, but I would say, collectively as a nation, as a society, as a Western people, What is your take looking reflectively back on the Iraq War as a whole?
Well, it's no, it was obvious to us on the ground at the time that the weapons inspectors were, very non-committal. It was hard to get to a sense of what the real situation was. And the popular sort of understanding of the Iraq War now is that the Bush administration lied, they didn't find anything, and the whole thing was a disaster. From my personal point of view as a professional journalist, I always knew that the whole suggestion that the U.S. was going into Iraq because of Al-Qaeda was not true, because Saddam Hussein had very tight control over that country, and the only Al-Qaeda presence at the time of the invasion was in the north, in Kurdistan, with an organization called Ansar al-Sunnah, was Al-Qaeda's satellite organization there. So that was an obvious lie to me, and I reported that repeatedly. People were very skeptical about weapons of mass destruction, but we couldn't really get to the truth because the inspectors were never firm one way or the other. What struck me most was that Iraq, after 12 years of sanctions, was in a very, very, very bad way, and had really suffered. It had fallen apart. And Saddam had cynically used the sanctions. He had done nothing to mitigate the effect of sanctions, and he had, in fact, had done a lot to amplify the effect, because that, and blame the Americans for that, because that was to turn Iraqi people against the Americans. So I didn't believe my job as a journalist was to support or be for or against the war. And I was shocked, actually, to see what a lot of my colleagues were doing. And I was shocked to see a lot of journalists wearing uniforms. But my sense of it always was that the invasion of Iraq was not like U.S. bombing campaign in Afghanistan, which had a direct link to 9/11. The link to 9/11 was sort of fabricated and exaggerated, but I still believe that we don't fully know everything about Iraq's weapons capabilities at the time, because I think there's a lot of stuff that went on that was hidden. Yeah. But the war was a disaster from the point of view of the Americans played right into Iran's hands, and they played into the hands of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. They brought the fight onto their turf, and the way it was done turned people all over the world, and especially in that country, against the U.S. It gave Al-Qaeda time to observe the U.S. up close and to perfect their way of fighting and the U.S. It achieved much more of their goals ever than it did anything for the U.S., right? It was a disaster from that point of view. What I think is very poorly reported and not well understood, and basically I think we're, in the media especially, we're willfully blind to it, and in the U.S. we're politically blind to it, is that the withdrawal of all U.S. forces under Obama was just as damaging and arguably more damaging as the invasion itself, because we abandoned all the institutions that we helped to create and build. We abandoned all the ideas that we asked people to believe in. We abandoned all the people that took a chance and did that for us. I mean, the Sunnis that turned on Al-Qaeda and fought side by side with American forces. What did we do? We abandoned them. Yeah. The institutions like free press and, independent, well, not independent, but newspapers and television stations and journalists, that we asked them to buy into the idea of a free press. We abandoned all those people. We turned our back on them. We didn't just pull out, militarily. We pulled out diplomatically and politically and in every possible way. I mean, we left a skeleton staff on the ground, and the American ambassador to Iraq just before the fall of Mosul, in December, before Mosul fell in the spring of the following year, was doing the rounds on Capitol Hill, begging people to listen to him, saying that Iraq is, one battle away from falling apart, and no one on the Hill was listening to him. He couldn't get the White House to pay attention. He couldn't get State Department. He couldn't get National Security. I mean, so there's a far greater betrayal and error of judgment and there's much more to that decision than has been superficially addressed and reported by us as a society and also by the media. And so I feel that we've been extremely negligent and dishonest in that capacity. And so, I mean, the precondition, the reasons for the invasion never made sense to me. I don't understand it. The consequences have been terrible and very damaging, not to mention the cost to many Iraqis. Another area where I think we're very dishonest in our rewriting of that war is to suggest that no Iraqis wanted that to happen and no Iraqis benefited from it. For every Iraqi who suffered because of the invasion, you can find an Iraqi who also benefited tremendously. Just look at what happened to the Shia. The Shia now control almost every institution in Iraq, and they controlled nothing under Saddam Hussein. They have a future now. They didn't have a future then, so on. Yeah. So for me, it bothers me that we simplify things and create narratives that are not reflective of the whole truth.
Yeah.
And the damage that we did to all of our relationships worldwide when we abandoned the Iraqis and pulled out, because they see it as abandonment, right? Was we sent a message that we can't be relied upon. And the saying today in Iraq is that the only thing worse than having America as an enemy is to have America as your friend. And in Afghanistan, they say the same thing. Yeah. We go in, we make promises, we break them, we don't keep them, and we betray people, we abandon them. And then when Mosul falls and we got to find ISIS, we go back in and we wonder why people aren't lining up, right? Now, yes, you can always get people to take the money, take the weapons, take the help that they need. But are those truly relationships that count? Are they ones that will hold up? Are those truly our allies? That's what, the fall of Mubarak meant to all of the other Mubaraks around the world who had actually been helping and working with the US, right? Oh, you don't stand by your friends. I'm not arguing for a different policy. I'm giving the point of view, how it looks to people from the other side.
Sure.
So for me, with abandoning Iraq and withdrawing from there is just as damaging as the original decision to invade, and there's very little that we've gained from either of those two things. But let's not suffer under any kind of delusion that ISIS was created because because of the invasion of Iraq, right? Nonsense. ISIS, first of all, they're the same guys who were Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that war predates the invasion of Iraq. Okay, that didn't begin in Iraq. That began with Osama bin Laden and the ideology of Al-Qaeda that he created, which was a combination of the Palestinian philosopher Abdul Azam and the manifesto written by one of the Qutb brothers of the Muslim Brotherhood in an Egyptian prison when he was in prison there, right? So for people who like to say politically it's convenient for us to blame it all on Bush and the Republicans and say all this started because we invaded Iraq. Actually, go back to the first fatwa from Osama bin Laden, right? Look at the bombing of the Kobar Towers. All of those events predate the invasion of Iraq, and they're all part of the same war.
Yeah.
So looking back on it, I just feel I'm not surprised we're still there in some form or another, and we don't have good answers. We've not addressed the situation with Iran, the Iranian-backed Shiite militias or the Popular Mobilization Forces that we were sort of fighting alongside at the time that Washington, Brett McGurk, Obama's presidential envoy, is trying to sell those people as patriots who are fighting for their country. The Iranian ambassador to Iraq is telling me, oh, we killed you guys. We're not on the same side. We just happen to be fighting the same people right now. We killed you before and we can't wait to kill you again. Yeah. Right? Yeah. That's what they're saying on camera. Yeah. Not even hiding it. It's not some secret information I have. If I know it, you got to know the U.S. knows it, right? Yeah. The U.S., the powers, the administration at the time knows it. This administration knows it, and the one before knew it too, let me tell you, because they were the ones in power when the Iranians were killing Americans in Iraq the first time around. Yeah. So what is my feeling looking back on it? I mean, it's a disaster, but what bothers me most is the dishonesty in the way it's remembered and portrayed. We have partial history, convenient partial history, and not a real one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and it's my question because of that statement, I guess, is whether it's Syria, whether it's ISIS, the pullout, the withdrawal. It seems like, and I know, I tend to lean more on the right or conservative viewpoints, but certainly wouldn't necessarily consider myself a staunch Republican. But the overwhelming majority of the media, just as you mentioned, the way that the withdrawal, the hasty withdrawal out of Iraq and the problems that caused, arguably more detrimental than the invasion itself, tends to be reported on, remembered with rose glasses, much more that way when it comes to a democratically led or a liberal-sided ideology.
I would agree with that. That's true.
And so I'm curious, from my perspective, that's a huge fucking problem in this country.
Yes.
And mine is how left leaning the media is, and I would ask a couple of things. Is that to me it's a surprise that Trump got elected in some ways. In some ways it's not, but given the backlash and the uphill battle that our society faces as it relates to the media and how powerful they are, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or most of the mainstream media outlets, and just how absurdly left-leaning they are. As a journalist, one, like, how do you combat that? And two, where do you even fucking go from there?
Well, this is a very important thing to talk about to me, and also one that I feel very painfully, because it makes my life hell, to be honest. I don't like cages, and for me, parties and labels and all of that, they're cages, right? I mean, so I don't identify as I don't identify myself politically like that. I've just always been that way. I know what's right, and I know what's good and what's not good. And when I meet people, I'm not looking at what party you belong to, or defining you because of where you live. Oh, you live in California, you must be, crazy liberal, or whatever. You live in Texas, you got to be a right-wing racist redneck, right? Republican kind of thing. I hate those stereotypes. First of all, they're just ridiculous. And secondly, they're not honest. And thirdly, they get wielded like weapons to silence people. So this conversation can be had on several different levels. One is an emotional level, perception, how we feel about it, all of that, my personal experiences. But maybe the best place to start is with the facts, right? You say the media is mostly liberal. Do I agree with that? Does everyone listening agree with that? What's our position on that? I agree with you. It's true. Why? Why can I say that with certainty? Well, first of all, because I've been part of this for all my life. I'm 47 now, and I've been a journalist since I was 17. And the media everywhere is mostly liberal, not just in the U.S. But in this country, 85% of journalists are registered Democrats. So that's just a fact, right? No one's registering Democrat when they're rarely a Republican. So the facts are on the side of what you just stated. Most journalists are left or liberal or Democrat or whatever word you want to give it. I always joke that the other 14% were too lazy to register. Yeah. And there's maybe 1% that's on the right. Yeah. That's a joke, but really when you think about it, visually, anyone who's ever been to Israel and been to the Wailing Wall has seen that the women have this tiny little spot in front of the wall to pray, and the rest of the wall is for the men. Mm-hmm. To me, that's a great representation of the American media, is that, in this tiny little corner where the women pray, you've got Breitbart and Fox News and, a few others. And then from there on, you have CBS, ABC, NBC, Huffington Post, Politico, whatever, right? All of them. And that's a problem for me, because even if it was reversed, if it was, mostly, right, on the right and a little bit, that would also be a problem for me. My experience has been that the more opinions you have, the more ways that you look at everything in life is complicated. Everything is gray, right? Nothing is black and white. Mm-hmm. You never have a fight, even the ones where you really think that you're in the right, where you're right about everything. So someone very smart told me a long time ago that how do you know you're being lied to? How do you know you're being manipulated? How do you know there's something not right with the coverage? When they simplify it all, and there's no gray. There's no gray. It's all one way. Well, life isn't like that. If it doesn't match real life, it's probably not, something's wrong, right? So, for example, all the coverage on Trump all the time is negative. There's nothing, no mitigating policy or event or anything that has happened since he was elected that is out there in the media that you can read about, right? Well, that tells you that's distortion of the way things go in real life. So my starting point is, okay, if I want to find the truth, where do I begin? I begin there, and I investigate from that point onwards. It's got nothing to do with whether I like Trump or don't like Trump, right? Or whether I believe him or don't believe in him or identify with him, don't, whatever. I don't even want to have that conversation because I approach that the same way I approach anything. I find that is not a popular way to work in the media today. Because although the media has always been, historically, always been left-leaning, we've abandoned our pretense, or at least the effort, to be objective today. The former executive editor of the New York Times has a book coming out, Jill Abramson, and she says we would do, dozens of stories about Trump every single day, and every single one of them was negative. She said, we have become the anti-Trump paper of record. Well, that's not our job. That's a political position. That means we've become political activists, in a sense, and some could argue propagandists, right? And there's some merit to that. So it doesn't mean that everything that's written is untrue. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't say anything about where I stand on it. I do my job today the same way I've always done it. Whether I'm reporting for CBS Radio or a newspaper in South Africa or 60 Minutes, my process doesn't change. I am consistent. Hopefully I get a little better at it, but regardless, I am consistent. So if I'm doing my job exactly the same way today that I've always done it, and suddenly today that makes me a Nazi and a fascist and, some kind of Trump lunatic, I'm like, how did we get there? So it's bad enough that in the media we lean towards one side of the political spectrum or we favor one ideology. But you could argue that that's just a function of the way it is, and that there's enough good journalism out there and there's enough in accountability that we at least get a decent representation of the truth a lot of the time. I don't even see that happening today, right?
And when it does, you're a fascist or you're crazy
or how would you even know?
Yeah.
Because at this point, the level of mistrust in the media is so high, and people really don't know what to trust anymore, what they can rely on.
Yeah, I mean the Trump coined phrase, the fake news. It's started as a joke, but Christ, it really is kind of that way. I mean, just like you said, there's so many times, especially if it's from a specific news outlet, specifically say MSNBC. I mean, you can rest the fuck assured that it's going to be, they're going to cherry pick the most significantly negative components to the story.
And people would counter that by saying, well, Fox is going to do all the positive stuff. But this is the problem that I have. There's one Fox. Yeah. There's one Fox. Yeah. And there's many, many, many more organizations on the left. So if you say, well, people, they're lying about this and this propaganda and whatever, and they're pushing their viewpoint. Oh, well, the other side does that too. Yes, both sides do terrible things. Both sides lie. Both sides manipulate. Both sides, push their point of view. But the problem is that the weight of all of these organizations on one side of the political spectrum. Yeah. When you turn on your computer or you walk past the TV or you see a newspaper headline, in the grocery store, if they're all saying the same thing, the weight of that convinces you that it's true. Yeah. You don't question it because everyone is saying it. Yeah. And unless you seek out Breitbart on your computer, you're probably not even going to know what the other side is saying, right?
Yeah, because it's not just mainstream media, right? It's social media. I mean, it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat,
Yes.
all of it is, I mean, even Google for that matter, which.
And we don't even question if what we see on social media is real or not. We don't even question if a grassroots movement is really grassroots. There's a way to start a grassroots movement. You write an algorithm and you create all this outrage, right? And you're throwing out all the sparks that light the fire. So then it becomes a grassroots movement because it takes nothing to set that in motion. But did it really begin as one? And if it didn't begin that way, if it was manipulated and paid for by someone and serves someone's political purpose, is it really what we believe it is? Oh, well, people were so moved or they were so outraged that they all rose up and stood up against it. No, people were manipulated into doing that. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So why that matters is because who's behind it? Who's doing it? And why are they doing it? And what else are they doing? Those things are profoundly significant. And we're not even trying to find out who it is, right? That really bothers me.
Yeah, well, it's very 1984 Orwellian. My question to you as a journalist is that where do you go from here? How do you even try to fix something like that? Do you have any
It's
thoughts?
the bane of my existence, Mike. It's the shadow that I have lived with for years now. I didn't even notice that there was a bias in the media. People would say it to me all the time, and I argued passionately and ferociously against that, because I really believe that when we do it well, and the majority of serious journalists were all trying to do their best to overcome those biases and rely on the facts and good systems. We have few conventions, if you like, because they're not really rules, but that you need at least 2 first-hand sources for something, right? Those things help keep you, keep your work to a certain standard. Those standards are out the window. I mean, you read one story after another or hear it, and it's all based on one anonymous administration official, a former administration official, right? I mean, that's not journalism. That's horseshit. Sorry, that is absolute horseshit. And so, how do you overcome it is a very complex question. It's not a simple question. If there was an easy answer to that, I would probably be doing that. I've thought about, I believe, and based on my experience, that people on all sides of the political spectrum really do want to know the truth. That even when they don't like the truth or it makes their lives more difficult, people realize that it's better to deal with the truth and come to terms with it and overcome it if you can, than it is to live a lie. And it really doesn't matter whether people, sometimes, I'm talking to people who agree with a lot of what I believe in. Sometimes I'm not. But over and over and over again, people say to me, why aren't there more journalists saying this kind of stuff? Why aren't there more journalists who want doing the work that you're doing? Why aren't there more journalists, owning this? Because I always say the responsibility for fake news begins with us. If we bear some responsibility for that, and we're not taking ownership of that and addressing it, we just want to blame it all, on somebody else, and that's not how life works, right? It's not how life works. So again, that analogy. Is that how it is in real life? No. So why is it like that in this case? So I do think that that people journalists have to stand up, and we have to back each other. And I don't mean backing someone being rude at a press conference at the White House, because quite frankly, I haven't seen a lot of that kind of behavior in my lifetime. I never saw someone treat George Bush like that. And I say that to my colleagues, and they say, well, George Bush never treated us the way, this president does. And I say, well, yeah, but I don't tell my kids, oh, that kid's an asshole, so you can just be an asshole to him, right? I tell my kids, you have to be consistently live to the standards that, that you have set for yourself. And even when someone's an asshole to you, you still have to be the better person and a good person, and you have to rise above it and not sink to their level. So what happened to that, right? So it's not, the problem is today that when you do try to stand apart from the crowd, from the mass of the media, right? And stray, if your narrative strays from the narrative that's really being pushed politically more than anything else, you're instantly a target. Like, I made one random comment about Benghazi in 1 hour and a half presentation that lasted seconds, basically. I mean, if it was a minute, I doubt it was a minute, but I've never actually timed it. And that was used to say that I should never have reported on Benghazi because I was biased. But you've got journalists standing up and saying, this president is a danger to all of us. He's the most, terrifying, terrible thing to have come along in a long time. We have to take a position against him and make sure, that he doesn't continue to harm all of us. And they're seen as independent and objective.
Yeah.
Well, that's ridiculous. So there's so much, but no one's going to argue with that. With what they're saying. Because
they want
Because they want that. And they control or have influence over or effect or have sympathetic ideological, beliefs as people across the vast majority of the media.
Yeah.
So that's the problem, is that you get targeted. I was targeted by Media Matters for America, who was an organization that was established by David Brock, who has dedicated himself to the Clintons, because he lied about them during the Whitewater investigation, and the rest of his life's been dedicated to them.
Yeah.
And they're a known propaganda organization who said that their stated intent was to destroy anyone who they saw as a threat to Hillary Clinton's bid for power. So when I happened to do a story about Benghazi that, honestly, I can tell you with absolute sincerity, was really nothing to do with Hillary Clinton for us, which is maybe stupid to people listening to that, naive. But that began for us as a story about, two Delta guys who begged everyone in Tripoli for money and hired a plane and flew into Benghazi and went to save people without ever being ordered to do so.
Yeah.
That's why I did that story. I wasn't thinking about Hillary and the election. I was thinking about an untold story that nobody else knew about. And I waded into political territory very naively and paid for that heavily.
Yeah.
But nothing that was said about me in the wake of that was true, right? None of it was true. But because you have social media, where these days, anyone can accuse you of anything, and you can't defend yourself.
Well, and it sticks until you prove it otherwise,
And how do you prove it otherwise?
Yeah.
How do I prove that I'm not, against Hillary Clinton or, Republican or whatever? Why should I have to prove that, first of all? And anyway, what if I was like a Republican, right? Would that be so evil? I mean, I'm not, and I'll never join a political party, and I probably will never vote in this country because that would be used against me. To me, that would be career suicide, right? I'm never going to do that because I can't. Because I don't care who's in power in terms of doing my job, right? That's not my that's not my business. It's not so much that it impacts what I do, of course, and I pay attention to it. But it's not about what I want. My job is to try to get to the truth and to find out how to tell this story in the way that matters most and is the most honest. Because we can be very manipulative and very dishonest when every one of our facts is correct, right? Mm-hmm. At 60 Minutes, often we would say, after going through a script 400 million times, we would do it again just before we go to air and say, is it fair to say this? Is this right? And we'd challenge each other, right? And sometimes you would defend something, or someone on the team would defend something, and you would say, no, this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and we got it from here, and we got it also from there, and so, there's nothing wrong with that. And I remember more than once, many times, looking at someone and saying, but we're giving the impression that this is the truth, that this is what's true. Like, the way that sentence is written, or where it comes in the story, or the amount of time we're spending on this issue, it's giving people the impression that something else is true. And we don't know that that's true, or we know that's not true. Sometimes we actually do know that's not true. So we may have the fact, but the way we've used it in the story, we've been exceptionally dishonest. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, right? So there's lots of ways to be manipulative or to be dishonest or to create perception, right, without having the facts. And not everyone has the luxury sometimes when you're rushing to air to think about that and to go through it and to work at that level, right? But this idea that we're just the innocent bearers of the truth today and we're being unfairly attacked and we're under siege like never before and unprecedented times and all those hyperboles, breathless hyperboles that I hear all the time, they make me crazy, but none more so than the idea that it's never been more important than now for us to do our jobs.
Yeah.
No, it's like I've done my job to the best of my ability from the moment I started this job, when I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I will do it to the best of my ability till the day I die. And it doesn't, if whoever's in power, it's going to be the same. This idea that we need to now be professional and vigilant. No, we always need to be professional and vigilant. We always need to have moral courage. Yeah. We always need to be, diligent. It's like, that's just the biggest cop-out ever. Yeah. And I've never seen myself as a victim. So this idea that we're the victim of this evil guy who's turning everyone against us. People gravitate towards the truth. They know what's real and what's not real, ultimately. And I'm responsible for my own actions. I concentrate on what I can do to be better and to be honest and to stand up for what I believe in. And I don't let people define me, and nobody owns me. Yeah. And you would think that would be really popular in the media, right?
Yeah. Well, it should be, but
it ain't.
But it's come full circle to how you were raised, right?
And I want to say really, really, really loudly, one ideological perspective on everything never leads to an open, free, diverse, tolerant society, right? The more opinions and views and people and, of everything that you have, the better off we all are. And so creating one morally defensible position, one ideological position on everything throughout your universities, throughout academia, in school, in college, in academia, in media, in everywhere else, that's what concerns me. Mm-hmm. I don't have to agree with everybody, and I don't mind telling you if I don't agree with you. I'll always listen and try to understand, but I don't mind telling you. I'll be straight up. But what bothers me is not that it's the left or the right. What bothers me is that it's one ideological position, one ideological view of everything. And if you move off that narrative in any direction, you're worthless. Yeah. And that is, wow, how did we get there?
Yeah. To me, as a kind of an outsider from a media standpoint and a political person looking in, to me, sometimes something I say a lot is some of the world's most complex problems actually require the simplest solutions. And I think with this, what it makes me think of is just, to oversimplify it, it really boils down to accountability. Is that whether it's politics or reporters, is that if you hold your own side as accountable as you would the other, everybody wins.
Yes. Well, that's what the First Amendment is about, right? Free speech isn't about, all of us like blowing off steam. Yeah. I mean, what it's really there for is accountability. Yeah. That's the purpose of it. Yeah. So you realize that when you see people break the law, for example, and if they're not held accountable, they didn't break the law. Yeah. They walk. Yeah. So I agree with you. Accountability is so profoundly important and significant. And that is why we're here as journalists. We're here not to hold people accountable as a substitute for the rule of law or for the courts. Trial by media, while it may have its moments where, sometimes if you can't find justice anywhere and this is the only, this is the only way really to go from injustice to justice, that's one thing. But what we seem to be doing today is substituting the law and the courts for trial by media, and that really disturbs me. That bothers me a lot. Keeps me up a lot at night. I don't want to say terrifies me because we're in the age of hyperbole at the moment, and I can't words like unprecedented are thrown around constantly. These are unprecedented times, really. So, heading into, the Vietnam War, or during the communist trials in America, and at other points in history, there's never been a time more important than this one, or more difficult, or more whatever. Like, this is what we do today. This is what bothers me. We're told over and over and over again that America is so divided, right? We're in this terrible situation right now because we're so divided. And we all accept that we're divided. But if you think about it, 40% of the electorate is in the middle, right? And has been for a very long time. All the elections live in our lifetime and in memory, most of them, not all, but most of them have been close, right? There's no landslides. I think, the last time there was a landslide was decades ago. So if elections are won by the narrowest of margins, well, that tells you we're not divided, doesn't it?
I mean, I guess there's multiple ways you can look at it. Can you...
Is there something new? Is there a new issue? I mean, abortion is not new. Race is not new. I mean, immigration is not new. I mean, yes, people have strong feelings about these things and they disagree, but I don't believe we are so divided. I think that what's happening is every day we're amplifying the differences. True. And we're focusing on those things and making them seem as if they represent the whole. And there's a lot of things that we agree on. Yeah.
I mean, when you have, there's a couple things. I think when you have social media and its ability to give people two things. One is time to respond instead of off the cuff. And I think more importantly, the other thing is a lack of accountability. Is whether it's anonymity or the fact that you can talk to somebody how if you were in person, rest the fuck assured you would not talk to them that way because you'd be held accountable for your fucking mouth. And because of that, I mean, I don't give a shit what any beta fucking bleeding heart asshole wants to say. That the reality of human nature is violence is the gold fucking standard. And if you disrespect somebody enough to their face, you're going to be held accountable for it. And the fact that there is a vacuum of that in our society now, and it just compounds on itself over and over, I think it makes it very easy for, I'll use Soros as an example because it gets amplified, but people like him, Koch brothers on the other side, same fucking thing, is that they have a much more ability in terms of power and influence to be able to divide people and to piss them off and to manipulate their emotions and make them to seem angrier than they actually are about things. But
the problem, Mike, that you're hinting at there is that you just did that thing of the same thing on the other side because you don't want to be seen as accusing, one side of something that both sides do. And you're absolutely right. The difference is that whatever someone on the left wants to whatever message they want to put out there, however they want to influence people, they have a much bigger, louder megaphone than people on the other side.
For sure.
That changes the game entirely. Yeah. Right? And completely. So what social media has done is, in one sense, it was supposed to have given us more freedom and made us, more powerful and given us access to more knowledge and information than any other time in history. And on the other side, in fact, what it's done is silence more people, right? You only have to look at the last election to see that. Social media and the media and these made it a terrible, terrible thing for anyone to stand up in public and say they supported Donald Trump. So most people lied about it. So if there were any polls that were actually looking for the truth and not trying to, not trying to substantiate a pre-desired an outcome that they intended to get no matter what. Yeah. If there were polls who were actually asking people honest questions, wanting an honest answer, they didn't get one a lot of the time because you'd have to be suicidal to stand up in public and say you supported Donald Trump, right? I mean, that was akin to walking with the devil and being one of the worst people on earth. I think, what did Hillary call it? Deplorable, right? Yeah. You jump right in the basket. Yeah. Who wants to be in that basket, right? Yeah. That's embarrassing. Nobody wants to be in that basket. So that's what I find that causes me a lot of concern is that information now has become much more powerful weapon. It was always powerful. The pen has always been mightier than the sword. But with the rise of social media and the cover it gives people, you don't know if any of these people writing on any of these websites are really outraged, people driven by their conscience, standing up for what's right. They could be paid political propagandists. They could be ideologically part of an organization and an organized movement. They could be an algorithm, for all you know, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we think things go viral because everybody loves them. No, things go viral because YouTube has people on their staff who write the algorithms that push those things forward to be in a position where they can go viral, right? Yeah. I mean, without that, ask someone from YouTube what the chances are that your stuff really goes viral. That's, that's an entirely different equation if you look at it like that. And really, the disturbing part for me is also that we don't ask those questions. Like, who's paying for it is one of the oldest questions in history. But we never ask that. When people show up to protest, right, to do a big mass protest, who paid for the buses? Who organized them? Mm-hmm. Who organized them? Who made it possible? Who provided the infrastructure to make all of that happen? These are very significant questions, and I feel like we don't even ask them today. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's it's a discussion we could have for days, frankly. But to me, like I said, I think ultimately it boils down to just straight up accountability, and it starts with yourself. And starts with whatever viewpoint that you tend to lean towards, and et cetera, et cetera.
And by the way, this is the kind of interview that is like professional suicide for me in many respects, right?
Well, I'm happy to be that guy for you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
You know what I mean? This is exactly what they target you for, is being honest like this and saying these kind of things, because it's not independent, honest voices that people are looking for. That's not, I mean, when I say people are looking for, yes, the average person out there wants that, but people who are very powerful in controlling the messages out there, they're not looking for that.
And that's, when you asked before we even started, why did you start the podcast? I mean, that is, in essence, one of the primary motivating factors for that, is that it does give, people like me or us, with this viewpoint, a platform and a medium of some sort. And the neat thing about it is, when you see how many people are listening to these episodes and the comments and messages that we get, is it's like, fuck, it's a breath of fresh air to hear people finally talk the way most of us actually feel, and so.
But you see, because you don't have advertisers that can be targeted and shamed into abandoning your program, and you don't have a corporate master who's going to fire you, and and all of that. But then you're also not getting paid to do this, right?
No, I'm not. I mean, but I answer to nobody, and so I mean, I do it because I'm passionate about it, and there still is, the ability to monetize things, but that's not why I do it. I do it because there's a vacuum as far as that goes, but. If we could pivot to just one thing, because I know it's a huge prominent event in your life, in your past, both professionally and personally. If we could, before we wrap up, talk about the incident in Egypt, if you feel comfortable talking about it. Mm-hmm. I know for the viewers listening, some of it, most of it's probably not a surprise. It was obviously a big thing in the news, but for me, knowing you at the time personally, and
that was when we met, just afterwards, right? When you showed up at my house with those ugly flowers.
Well, you're welcome. It's the best I could do.
I will say it wasn't just you, a complete stranger, showing up on my doorstep with flowers. No, there were
mutual friends, at least.
Some mutual friends were involved in that equation.
But I would love to get, just because I think it's important for people to hear both from an ideology standpoint, the enemy that we face. Some of the cultures and how different they are, and the experience that you went through. If it can help anybody out moving down the road, I think it's an important lesson. So,
what happened to me, I think is a lot more about the last subject we were just talking about information warfare, than it is about for example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Of course, there's lots of overlap there, just starting with the fact that Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was probably definitely one of the most important, arguably the most important ally for the U.S. in the war on terror, because the Egyptians were doing all the renditions, and interrogations and running black sites for the U.S., and Egyptians were able to infiltrate Al-Qaeda and that more easily than Americans, right? And so Egypt was a very, very, very close partner to the U.S., but not just in the war on terror. Egypt's been a close partner to the U.S. with Israel and for a long time in the Middle East. So when Mubarak who had been in power for so long, was at that moment when, with all the protests and the rise of social media, and the rise of 24-hour news, the existence of 24-hour news, combined with Facebook and Google and social media, looking at the power of that regime, which was on the brink of losing everything, right? They used some of the tactics that, quite frankly, the kind of tactics that we have used too, that nations and countries all over the world do. So, and then what they did was target journalists so that they could intimidate journalists into not coming to their country and covering these events, which exposed them so much, and at a moment when they had everything to lose. So in one sense, it wasn't personal. In another sense, I was personally selected because as a correspondent for 60 Minutes and as a woman, I fit the ideal description for them to get mass amount of attention, and the nature of the tactic they were using, being gang rape, was a tactic that's often effectively used against women. So that's kind of the political context for really what was happening. For me, I had gone to Egypt to cover the so-called Arab Spring because it was a big deal. And having worked and lived in the Middle East and areas around it for a long time, I knew how significant it was that the balance of power was about to change in such a profound way. And, like a lot of journalists, right? I wasn't the only one, but it was just a big, 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 big deal. And I'd been in Egypt before and worked there before. So when I went in, the CBS News team were not that happy. They didn't want someone from 60 Minutes coming and bigfooting them. So I got shunted up to Alexandria. They got rid of me as fast as they could. And I covered the whole uprising from Alexandria, which is the birthplace of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And the U.S. had rendition ships parked in the harbor off the coast of Alexandria. So I didn't mind because it was an interesting place to be, and that's really what I care about. But when I was off the clock for news and heading down to Cairo for 60 Minutes, our team was stopped in some of the many, many checkpoints on the outskirts of the city. And the short version of that is that after, we spent 18, 20 hours in Egyptian custody being interrogated, and one of our team badly beaten, an Egyptian member of our team, a driver. I was very, very sick with dehydration and ended up unconscious in one room of the cells with a very filthy old IV shoved into my arm. Stabbed, actually, is more like it. But anyway, so when we came out of that and made it out of that, we went to the airport and I came home, and that was really difficult for me because I knew Mubarak was still in power, but we knew it was the end and I wanted to be there. So I kind of waited until I was in the shower with my husband and for obvious reasons, and said, so obviously I need to go back to Egypt.
You do that while you're in the shower.
I still remember the exact conversation. And, my husband and I share this passion for
showers.
No, I wasn't. Well, not for showers. Yeah. For for these subjects, right? He's driven by the same interests and things that I am. And so I knew, I quickly turned the conversation to a discussion about the significance of the end of the Mubarak regime. And he was like, oh, yeah, you got to go back, So a week to the day later, I landed back in Cairo. And it's so funny because my producer, Max McClellan, is one of the greatest human beings and greatest producers ever to have lived. I met him in the airport and he had a new sweater on. Well, one I didn't recognize, not new. I said, Max, you got a new sweater? Because I know everything in that man's wardrobe, right? There's only about 6 things. And at that point, we'd worked together for like 14 years. And Max said, no, sheepishly, he's like, no, it's not new. He's like, my wife wouldn't let me wear the other one. And I was like, why? And he said, well, because, when we were separated at the checkpoints and they finally hunted him down and threw him against a wall at another part of the city, they didn't have any handcuffs, and they were looking for something to handcuff. No, they handcuffed him. They were looking for a blindfold. They didn't have anything to blindfold him with. And so he said, well, you could use my sweater if you want. And he obviously told his wife this story. And she was like so annoyed. She was like, no, you're not wearing that. Yeah. If you're going back, you're not wearing that. So he dug something out of his old college wardrobe and he wore this old sweater. Anyway, 10 minutes after we landed in Cairo, we got the news that we were still in the airport. Mubarak had stepped down. And all we wanted to do that night was get to the square. That's all we wanted to do. And there were people in the streets everywhere. We stopped and filmed a little bit on the way. But then we got to the hotel, got our stuff together, sent part of the team one place, part of the team another place, and rushed to the square. And I had Richard Butler, my colleague who was kidnapped in Iraq and Somalia and few places, and I had Max with me, and we went into the square, and honestly it was like a big party, and it was, people were saying thank you Mark Zuckerberg, thank you Facebook, thank you Google, this is your revolution, all of that stuff. And it wasn't until Richard's camera light went out, but you got to know the Egyptians knew. I mean, they, the Mukhabarat, their intelligence organizations are extremely sophisticated and vast. So they knew the moment I landed. In fact, they knew before I landed that I was coming back. So the chances are that I was targeted, maybe even before I got there. Yeah. Journalists were being, pushed around, and some more severely than others. Some running into other problems in the square. And it didn't help that the Egyptians had said that journalists were considered, the enemy. And it was just one moment like that when someone said something and someone else said something else, and I was oblivious because I didn't understand those sentences and phrases in Arabic. And our young Egyptian fixer turned around and looked at me with terror, and he was just literally white as a sheet. And he said, "We've got to run." And I don't argue with local guys, right? I mean, it's a time to argue, and that is not it. So I started running, and I thought that people in the crowd were trying to help us, and later realized that they weren't, that those guys locked onto me, and some of the people I thought were trying to help me were among those people trying to tear my clothes off and grabbing my breasts and all of that. And it just, I got separated from the rest because the crowd, the mob forced us to do that. I mean, they forced people away from me, and they wanted to separate me. That was the whole purpose. The only person that I was holding on to was Ray Jackson, our security guy, who hadn't been with us the week before when we were arrested. He had come with us. We did that to sort of keep CBS happy and make them think that we were, taking extra security precautions and all that. And I had Ray. He screamed at me to hold on to him, and I grabbed the front of his shirt, the collar, and I didn't let go until they tore him off me. And the whole time in the beginning, for at least the first 20 minutes or so, Ray was able to tell me what was happening. I guess he saw more than anybody, but it was very hard to see everything because I was buried under a sea of men. And of course they were, I felt people putting their hands between my legs and all this, and I was like, trying to push them away and thinking, it almost took me a moment really to realize, wow, like, because you've been in a crowd before, people have touched you inappropriately or whatever, but it became apparent that this was very different and somewhat overwhelming. And I don't know, like, how much detail you can stand, but piece by piece, they tore all my clothing off and really tore my body almost to pieces and tore my insides apart.
What is there an element of consciousness that was lost at that point? I mean, were you?
Sadly, no.
I mean, you were.
No, in fact, I was conscious of everything, every little thing. I mean, I don't relive all of it. I guess there are kind of gaps in my memory. I don't really see them as gaps. It's just things that are not there in all the detail, but I still remember them happening. It was like I was living on two tracks the entire time. So one track is going really, really, really slowly, where you're conscious of every little thing and you're having a whole conversation with yourself and you're seeing things. I saw people taking pictures. I remember the one guy whose face I bit. I was conscious of the feeling of the air on my skin because the night air was kind of cool and I could feel that. I remember the sound of my bra strap snapping. I remember the sound of my necklace breaking. I remember fighting, being raped, and being able to sometimes push people away. And then I remember just realizing that there were too many of them, and that it was over and over and over and over again, and that there was always someone else. When you could fight one person, and there was always somebody else. And I felt no pain. I will tell you that. I felt no pain. Ray was saying they're beating us with sticks, they're beating us with flagpoles, they're doing this to us, they're doing that to us. I do remember thinking, wow, they're literally going to tear this skin from my skull. Like, it's not someone trying to pull your hair. I remember thinking they're trying to tear my scalp away. They're trying to scalp me. And being conscious of all those details. And I remember being very humiliated. And it was even psychologically and emotionally painful. The humiliation of rape was very painful, even in that moment. But at the same time, I'm having, everything is going so fast. And before I know it, I can hardly breathe. And the weight of all these men on my body is overwhelming me. And when I lost Ray, was really a terrible moment because I felt all the life drained from my body, my strength really drained from my body. And I thought, oh my God, like, this is it, right? I mean, I'd like to tell you that you're spared the nastiness of it all, but I wasn't. I was very aware of how filthy it was. And it was very, and I knew that this was a filthy, meaningless death on a dirty street in the worst possible way. And so when I lost Ray, I had that moment of clarity that I had no longer had the strength in my body to fight. And I had, on my own, no chance of survival. And I thought about my children.
Did you, at that point, were you convinced that you weren't going to survive it?
I knew I had to stop fighting the sexual assault and the sexual part of it and fighting. I really was trying to, in a way, fighting for my dignity and fighting to prevent that from happening. And I realized, I faced the fact that I had no dignity left. I mean, you're naked in a crowd and people have your body, right? And you're being raped and sodomized. I mean, there's no dignity left in that. So, and I was really dying because I couldn't breathe properly anymore. And I had very little strength left. So I thought, wow, you have to save that strength and fight for your life now, because what you're clinging to is gone. And when I lost Ray and thought about my children, I had given up, and it was fleeting. That's the fast part, right? It was literally just a moment. But I thought, I'm not going to do that to them. How could I actually? What I really thought, because I remember this with absolute clarity, was how could you do that to them? How could you give up? And Lola was 10 months old at that time, and Joe was 1 year and 2 months older than her. So, he was 1, almost 2, I guess. I don't know. Yes, and not almost 2. 1 year and must have just turned 2. And so I did think very consciously, I'm not going to do that to them. I'm going to fight to the end, so that when they read about this, or when they learn about it when they're older, they will know that I died fighting. And I guess if there's one thing I'm kind of proud of, I'm proud that my instinct in that moment was the one I would have made the same decision if I had all the time in the world. I would die fighting. Because when you make that decision, it's very powerful in the sense of your own power, because you have no, to everyone else, you're completely powerless, right? I mean, I'm heading for death, and I have no ability to change that equation in that moment. But the one thing I can have some say in is how I die, right? Mm-hmm. What that says about me as a person. And instinctively, I knew that one thing I could give my children was to know that I died fighting. It wouldn't be much, not like having a mother growing up, right? Yeah. But it's something about who I am. That's in my words about who I am. And then, Ray kept screaming at me, stay on your feet, because of course I couldn't stay upright all the time. And I was very grateful that I had a good, strong pair of boots on every time I was fighting to get up. And I knew if I laid down that it was over, right? I would be dead. So the last time I went down, I didn't have the strength to get up anymore. And I was sort of dragged. And there was just one part of the square where women and children had been camped and were living. And really, I think the Egyptian men and young men and boys that jumped up and put themselves between the women and the mob, they did that as much to protect their own as for me. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it was for both. I'm not sure they would have done it just for me, but it doesn't really matter. What was hard for me in that moment was that suddenly there was space between me and certain death. Suddenly there was space between me and just the air alone. You can't breathe in that air. And it was a chance that I could actually live. And I was so afraid that they were just going to reach back and drag me back into that mob. And I thought initially that when Ray was taken from me, that was the moment, that signed my death warrant. But I actually would you believe it? It took me at least 3 years or so to realize that Ray was the one who went and got the army to come and find me.
Really?
And if he hadn't forced the army to do that, they weren't going to do anything.
Do you know from the time that it started do you know how long that process was?
I was told that it was just over 40 minutes. I have to say, though, I've never really believed that because to me, it felt much longer. I would have said it was over an hour.
Yeah.
But who knows? I'll never be able to prove that.
Yeah. So was that kind of the saving grace then? As Ray got the army, they came back?
Yes, because they beat their way. They took batons and they beat their way through the mob. And there was no other way through that mob. You know what I mean? It wasn't... and they weren't going to open fire on their own people or anything like that. They weren't going to fire into the air. I mean... batons are maybe we make it through, maybe we don't, right? Yeah. Like we'll see how much effort we're going to put into this. Yeah. And when they got to me, finally, they wouldn't touch me because I was naked. I mean, pants and my boots were still on, so my pants were stuck around my ankles, but they were shredded, right? I mean, they tore everything apart, including, by the way, like my skin, I could see. I had marks for long time afterwards where hands had been, where they were trying to tear my breasts off my body, where you could see their fingers, but it was etched in blood deep in my skin. So it took a long time to go away. But people were throwing things at me in the crowd, like items of clothing. And eventually, the women were pouring water down my throat to help me breathe and all of that. And eventually, the soldiers came back with a chador, traditional black robes, and put that over me. And then they picked me up and carried me, while other soldiers still had to beat their way through that mob, right? Yeah. I mean, I was clinging to that soldier like I can't even describe it to you, because the thought that chance to live would be taken from me was more terrifying at that point even than being raped. I just couldn't stand. Yeah. I just thought, I can't do it again. Yeah. I can't do it again. Like, I made it this far, but I won't make it this far again. Yeah. If they take me back, that was unimaginable to me at that point. That was just like the worst thing that I could possibly think of at that point, was that I had that chance and I was so afraid that it was going to be taken from me. Yeah.
From that point, when once you recovered and removed from the mob, what was that timeline like from then? Like, did they treat you at a hospital there? Did they get you on a plane?
I had a doctor come to my hotel room. But, our Egyptian driver who had been beaten, he came to the soldiers with his arms out. I remember seeing him. And he took me in his arms and he walked me up this little alleyway off the side of the square. And Max and Richard and everybody was waiting for me. And I remember Max just fell down on the ground at my feet, and he just kept saying, "I'm so sorry." And I just kept saying, "Max, you can't believe what they did to me. Yeah. You can't imagine what they did to me." But I realized nobody knew. They couldn't see, because I was covered in those black robes. And so the Egyptian army wanted us to walk back to the hotel, and we'd walk to there. We had no vehicle, and we wouldn't, they wouldn't do that because we were afraid. There's millions of people between us and the hotel, and obviously not all of them were in a good mood, let's say. So they brought a small Egyptian military vehicle, and we piled into the back. And as we started to take off, I remember seeing our Egyptian fixer and this young man who had been with me, and he was such a lovely man. And he just started vomiting onto the ground. And I screamed at this point. And I said, "We're not leaving him. We're not leaving him." And we grabbed him. We just pulled him into the back, and he lay on top of us, this tiny little military jeep kind of thing. And the doctor that night at the hotel, I wanted to talk to him because nobody wanted to talk to me. Nobody wanted to look at me. Nobody knew how to look at me. It wasn't, that nobody cared. It was that, as Max and Jeff said to me, because I made them sleep with me that night in the hotel, and they slept on the floor. And I was still so scared, Is that my dog? Yeah. Rose, you bad dog. Come here, Rosie. Sit down. Come on, sit down. Damn, this someone want to get this. We got the door, we got the dog, we got everything going on. Hold on one second. Sure. I'm so sorry. I'll be back. Wait. Will you grab Lola? And Lola, Renee's here.
I'm sorry.
My daughter has Spanish. So she's in my room, I think. Renee, will you grab her for me, please? Thank you.
Sure, right there.
She's fine. She won't move because she's so afraid I'm going to make her go outside. I can put my lipstick on. Rosie, stay. Stay there, okay? Stay there, bad dog. So.
What's up? Oh, sorry. I thought that was...
Sit. So, Rose, stay. Out. That'll make her sit more than anything. Rose, Okay, stay. Done. Don't move. So, the doctor at the hotel didn't want me to talk, and nobody knew what to do. You know, I made Jeff and Max sleep with me, but they lay on the floor, and I just remember being so scared, and I didn't want to make them lie in the bed with me. I didn't even know what to say, but they didn't want to make me feel more violated than I already did. You know, they didn't know what to do. And that's how it was with everybody. No one really knows what to do in that situation. It's not their fault.
Yeah.
But I realized sitting in that hotel room when my boss was calling, asking what was, you know, how we were going to still get the story done. And Max is sitting on my bed talking about, you know, the shoot. I realized at that moment that they have no idea what really happened.
Yeah.
Rose, you're going out. I gave you a chance and you blew it. Come on. Okay, wait. Nothing like food to get it done. Do what you want. Get your treats. See, my husband throws her out. But a dog is, you know, even when she really wants to be inside, she can't say no to the bacon bits. Come on, Rosie. One that's not even open. Shit, Rose, I'm gonna kill you.
I can move it.
Wait.
I can just pick her up if you want.
No. Come on. Watch this. Watch out what this is. Come on. Rose, come on, let's go. Oh, come on, Rosie. Rose. Oh my God. Rose. Sorry. Oh, don't make me get this one. Hold on. So Mike, come on, you're the big dog guy.
I mean, I would just pick her up. That's what I would do.
Do you pick her up?
I
Or
would.
do
Or
this?
you want to?
Okay, pick her up. And I'll still put her treats out here for her. She's not light, by the way.
No, I tore my tricep. I can't if you.
Oh.
I know. I'm getting old.
I just tease it. She's very heavy. Look, she's doing all her tricks too. Sorry, Rosie.
I'm trying to be sweet. It's priceless.
I'll get rid of the door. There we go. Thank you.
Me and my broken fucking chicken wing.
That dog likes to be inside. Boy, she picks her moments, right? She's got a good timing.
All right, so you good?
I get you to move in just a little closer.
Me or her? Either.
Yeah.
Both. Look.
Oh, we're in.
It's in dog feng shui.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
All right, so at this point, your head shed at the network doesn't even really know what happened.
Yes. So, you know, when someone's leg is blown off or they're shot or, you know, they're blown up or something like that, everybody has an instant understanding of it. But so one of my first realizations in the square that night was that of how distinct sexual violence is, because first of all, no one wants to talk about it. It's hard to find the words. It's kind of embarrassing even, and uncomfortable, makes everyone uncomfortable, and it's not visible, right? I'm not going to take my clothes off and show you like all my bruises and wounds and everything else. Mm-hmm. So when I heard Max having that conversation, I waited for him to get off, and I said to him, Max, I need you to do something for me. I said, I need you to get everybody out of the room and then get my husband on the phone. And I called, I told my husband, I said, I want to tell you everything they did to me, and I need you to listen. And when I'm done, I want you to pick up the phone and call my boss, because I couldn't tell him those things. It's too hard. And my husband is trained, you know. I mean, he was in the Army for 23 years. And in the part where he worked, none of this surprised him. So I did, and he did that. And after that, everything kind of changed, you know. Not that people understood it, but my boss understood it. And so we flew back the next day, and I went straight to hospital. Back to Colonel Mike Dietz, a friend of ours, and my husband. They met me at the airport and took me straight to the hospital, and I stayed there. But that was a sort of another form of torture for me, because my daughter took her first steps at home, and I missed it. I was in the hospital. So I just wanted to get home, you know. And there's nothing they could do for the internal injuries anyway. And unfortunately, I have a lot of scarring, and recovery is long, you know. You're never free, right? Everything has a price. So I got to live, but there was a price, which is okay. It's a price I'm happy to pay.
Yeah. You know, there's two things. I mean, one, hearing that story and having been to, you know, a lot of countries where the predominant culture is accepting of things like that and whatever, it's hard not to be violently fucking angry, you know, hearing that as being a friend of
Mike,
yours. And
I just want you to know, though, in Egypt, I didn't know at the time, so many women are subject to sexual violence, and it's a form of control, because if women know that if they go out of the house on their own, they're not safe, well, what do? They always make sure they have a man with them. So if they don't have a man with them, they don't go. Yeah. So it's a form of social control, and so many Egyptians over the years, and even today now, when I speak at different places or meet people, so many, if there's an Egyptian there who realizes, you know, that I'm this person that this happened to in Egypt, they always come to me, men and women, and tell me, I'm so sorry. And they're very, you know, very moved and pained that this happened in their country. And they always apologize on behalf of Egypt. And I always tell them not that they don't have to do that, you know. I mean, you and I know that bad things happen to good people everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I mean, people are raped in this country, right? People are gang raped in this country. And certainly in South Africa, I saw mobs chop people up and, you know, and set them on fire. So it's not like it's different from what I grew up with in South Africa. At the end of apartheid, there was a rape every 22 seconds, right? And many of those rapes were babies, let alone children. So it isn't completely separate from the culture, but it's not. I don't blame the culture in the place. This was a very strategic attack. It's, you know, people in the crowd were saying, let's take our clothes off, let's do this, let's do that. And that was the spark that was needed for bad people to take that and run with it. Yeah. And in that mob situation, it went off the charts. There are good people in Egypt, and there are bad people. You know, I got to tell you something. I've never, ever been angry. I never thought about revenge. I never thought even about justice. Maybe because, I mean, obviously I would think it was appropriate if people who were guilty of that were held to account, and I think that would be most important for all the other people, right? That would be spared because of that. It's not going to change anything for me. Yeah. The most powerful thing I ever heard in my life. Dad, come on. My son's going to his Spanish lesson, but one of the most powerful things I ever heard in my life from a woman who was raped in South Africa and almost killed. I mean, they slit her open and slit her throat, right? It was a miracle that she survived, and she's one of the most unbelievable women you could ever imagine, right, that people like that even exist. But I learned something from her at her trial when she was asked how she managed to recover and be so strong, and because her testimony got these guys arrested, her description in the emergency room got those guys arrested, and she said, they took so much from me that night. Why would I give them the rest of my life as well? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that's kept me strong. The initial thing is one part of the recovery, but really the much harder thing is the long term, making your peace with it and living with it. And you're under this pressure. I was under tremendous pressure, I think, especially professionally, to prove to everybody that I was the same person that I was before this happened to me, or that I hadn't completely lost my mind, or that I was still capable of doing my job and all of that. And also not to talk about it, because if you talk about it, it's a sign that you're not over it, right? If you mention it, then you're, then you somehow are not whole. Erasing it is the sign of that you are recovered. Well, that's ridiculous. You don't ever erase the things that happen to you. Yeah. No one asks you to grow your leg back, right? So for me, Alison, her words at that trial where she said, why would I give them the rest of my life as well? That's what I live by. Yeah. Why would I give them any more of me than I have to? Sure. And I don't, there are moments where it's harder than I would like it to be. And there are times where I'm reminded, not so much the physical sexual things, more as like if my husband pushes me, and that can trigger that feeling when I'm being forced against my will and I can't stop it. I just tell him, and it usually works. Mm-hmm. Usually. But the hard, the harder thing is just getting people to understand that you can heal and you can be whole without being unaffected. Yeah. And for me, I physically, the effects on my body have been in some ways harder to live with than psychologically. Yeah.
Has the psychological aspect, has that affected the relationship with your husband? Or, I mean, it's hard for me to think that it wouldn't to a certain extent.
He kicked into professional mode, especially in the beginning, and I think sort of compartmentalized it and didn't really deal with it. And I think for a long time I didn't fully understand or pay much attention to how it affected him. That sounds kind of selfish, but mostly because he didn't show it. Mm-hmm. And because he's sort of not your average guy, right? Your average guy couldn't hear the gory details of what happened to his wife from her in that moment. I mean, so because of that, I think I sort of underestimated how much it affected him. Yeah. More than didn't pay attention to it. And a year later, I got breast cancer, and that could have killed me as well. So over time, it kind of came out with him that he became more protective, and obviously more. And that for me is more restrictive. Yeah. And I remember once it all sort of going up in flames in an argument, and where he said, like, like, for God's sake, I've almost lost you twice. I don't want to lose you again. And that was the beginning of my sort of realizing, wow, he's not okay with all of this. He hasn't dealt with it. Yeah. So it affected us a lot in that way, I think. Yeah. But I will say, I mean, 2 weeks later, he was already badgering me to have sex with him. And I was like crying in a bucket. I just, it was, gang rape only buys me 2 weeks, and you're nagging me. And then we started laughing, Yeah. So I don't know how many couples could have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's the shower mechanism. Did he That's your guys.
Yeah, you said, I know it'll make you feel better, honey. How about a shower?
Let's jump in the shower. Yeah, no shit. Well, I mean, for me, it's I know it's a tough thing to talk about. I appreciate it. I know the listeners will appreciate your willingness to open up and share that story, and it's an important, powerful one that I know a lot of women internationally have dealt with, and so I appreciate you telling us about it. I would like to ask now at this point, as we come to a close, is what now for you, professionally, personally? What do you want to be when you grow up?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, right now I'm a mom and I'm still working, of course. And journalism is always, right up there at the forefront of everything important to me. But I'm a little disillusioned by the state of things. And so that makes it harder. And I'm consumed with being there for my children. I really love being with my kids, you know? I mean, that's the best time that I can have. Yeah. And I'm very conscious of every day with them. I mean, when I travel now, I don't just disappear and go off to Baghdad for 5 years or stay in Kabul for a year or, all that kind of stuff. I have to really limit myself. And the hardest part is that, I went to Liberia at the height of the Ebola epidemic, to a frontline treatment center and then into quarantine. And doing those things now when my children can look at me and say, Mom, because I embedded with the Taliban once and I may have been having similar conversations recently, and my son overheard some of that and looked at me and said, is that now or before? Mom, is that now or before? And I was like, oh, that's before, sweetheart, kind of like guilty. Yeah. Caught. So I don't even know now whether I can do that or not, and that particular instance is somewhat extreme, right? Sure. But that would be the kind of thing that I would do because I don't want to just do what everyone else is doing, and also because it's really important to me to talk to them in this moment and understand where they are as the U.S. negotiates its surrender from Afghanistan without the job being done. Yeah. And the job, I mean, the goal of defeating Al-Qaeda after 9/11, since they're not defeated, right? Yeah. But so I'm always going to do what I believe in, always. So that's not over for me. And I am working with an amazing production company out of Montana to try to do a series about the wars. But I've got a lot of other stuff going on as well. And mostly, the most important thing to me now is being the best mom I can be while I have the chance. Because no matter how worthy or important I might think what I'm doing is, it doesn't mean anything to anyone like what it means to my kids to have me there in the night when they wake up, or you know what I mean? Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's the most important thing for me to do right. There will always be stories. There won't always be, kids in elementary school running around. So, and even if they're not just stories to me, which very few of them are, even then, right? I mean, sometimes you do miss out and you don't get it back. I was always the girl who said you could have everything. And what I realize now is that you can have everything. You just might not be able to have it all at the same time. Yeah. And everything, that definition of everything changes. Because I've had the career and I have the family and I still have the career. But my career from a small town in Texas, when I cut back from my work at 60 Minutes by 70%, is not the same as my career when I was on the East Coast, right? Traveling to 5 different states in 1 week and 2 continents. Yeah. Forget it, right? Yeah. It's not. Flying me out and back on one day to put a 3-minute segment into an interview. To do stuff like that, obviously, you got to be there. That's crazy. You're working at a crazy level. Yeah. That's just something else entirely. So if that's what matters to you, and it's really important, you can have children and have someone else raise them for you because you're not going to be present, right? Because that's impossible. Yeah. But then, for me, what I realized was, wow, I can do that, but then I'm not going to be able to be the mother I want to be.
Yeah.
Like, so something has to give. Everything has a price.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I love that you prioritize it that way.
I know what I'm going to do.
So.
I'm going to have a margarita.
All right.
And some good food at my favorite place on Main Street.
Well, hell yes.
I'm taking you to Hondo's on Main.
Well, it's about to get fucking real here in a minute, folks. So margaritas and God knows what else. One thing that, as you've told me these stories, and I knew, glimpses of some of them, but certainly not to the depth and detail with which you've shared with us today. Have you thought about writing a book? I know it would be 4,000 fucking pages long, but I mean, honestly, like there should be a book and a movie, or when you talk about a series, like there should be a mini series of your life. I think, like with the stories you've been through, it baffles me that you haven't written one.
Everybody asks that. I get asked that all the time, and I know I will. It's just I really like to say I like to tell people everything.
Yeah.
And all the stuff that happened, and some of that stuff is kind of tricky if it gets out. And I know I could do the book without all of that, but then it won't be as much fun, and it won't be as real as me.
It won't be the whole story,
and it won't be the whole story. So I toyed with the idea of leaving it for my kids to publish after I'm dead, and all the people who are mad at me will not be able to yell at me. Well, they can yell at my grave. No, I don't want to. I want to be cremated. By the way, just in case you ever hear that someone's burying me, you can step in on my behalf and say, she never wanted to be in a box with insects eating her body. I want to melt into the ocean somewhere. So I'm definitely will write, and I think I know I'm going to write more than one book, but I'm not really sure I want to do the autobiography kind of thing. I sort of want to do it maybe a little differently, write it in another way. And I'm trying to figure that out. But I'm also trying to figure out how much of me do I want to give to everybody? Because there's lots of amazing people out there, but there's, some people are not going to take it as it's intended. And what are the consequences of that? What's the price of that? But at the same time, I know you're not given this life just for you, right? It's not just for me. I didn't get lucky just for me. My story doesn't just belong to me, in a sense. None of our stories do. So if there's something in your story, and I know there is in mine because of the people that have told that to me in very powerful ways, if something of me belongs to people who need it, then I owe them, right? So I know I'll do it. But I'm not going to be doing it when I'm up at 7 o'clock making breakfast and collapsing in bed at night, doing the homework. I think that it's going to come slowly. I have written parts of it, actually. But fragments, I would say, more than chapters, right? I've written fragments of it.
Yeah, well, that's good. I know.
And also, wait, I want to say one thing before you go. So it's like people might wonder, well, how could she talk about Egypt like that as if it's like nothing, The thing is, it's you. And I know that that makes it easier and harder in some ways. It's easier because I know that you're asking me for all the right reasons. But it makes it harder because I know how much you care. And so I just, this is not the average podcast for me. Because I know... I know who you are, and that means a lot to me. And you drove halfway across the country to my door when that happened to me, right? So we go right back to that moment, you and I, and I care a lot about you. So I just I never had that conversation like that in person with someone I care about.
For me, it was. It was hard to hear, and
I spared you the gory details.
I know. Even still, knowing what all is encompassed in that experience, it's hard to hear. But to me, to not hear it and to not understand, denies some of the fact that it happened. I think, and I think it's important to know about it and And again, I can't thank you enough for sharing it and being willing to sit down and be this open and honest with me, with the listenership, if you will, that I have, and I know that they'll love the story and really appreciate you sharing it with them. So I cannot thank you enough for doing that. I appreciate it very much.
It's like I said to you when you asked me to do this interview. I'd never say no to you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it very much. It means the world to all of us. So thank you. And is there anything you want to share?
Well, I just didn't know you were going to deny me food for this long.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. You're welcome. It seems to be a recurring theme: shitty flowers and no food. But
that might be the story of all of your relationships, right?
Yeah, maybe that. Yeah, that's maybe there is a recurring theme. I don't know. I appreciate everything that you've shared with us today, opening up your home to me and the team to be able to conduct this. Your family's beautiful. The property's amazing. And I can't thank you enough for sharing. So I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mike.
For all you out there, I hope that you got something out of this podcast. I know that you did. And I know that you're as appreciative as I am to have these stories shared. Take a few moments to digest everything that you've heard on this episode and take it to heart and put it to good use in any aspect that you can apply it to your life. I cannot thank you guys, the listeners, enough for the support that you continue to show both me and the team that produces this show, because it is a team effort, and they work their ass off on it. I show up and flap my gums. So thank you to them. Thank you to you guys. Appreciate you. We'll see you next time. And until that next time, this is MikeDrop.